Uh, Welcome. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and really pleased to have you with us. I am the very privileged person who's the president of the Urban Institute, and I'm really excited to welcome you to this summit today, which will tackle the question of how emerging technologies can help serve a critical task, that of inclusion, ensuring the great gifts of our urban life, the economic and social and cultural assets of our cities and communities all across the country are available to all of our residents. If you want to join the conversation, try to take a little brief break from your email, but you can pull out the phones if you like to join the conversation online using the social media hashtags Live at Urban and Innovation for Inclusion. And you'll also notice that on your agendas today, you'll find the Twitter handles for all of the speakers, so you can engage them, ask questions of them for future conversation, or talk about them online. And I also think we'll probably soon have a couple more chairs for those of you standing in the back. I also want to welcome our live stream audience, those of you who are with us now live, and probably they'll be online later for those of you later. If you're here with us now, we encourage you to submit questions to events@urban.org at any time during the program, and those will get filtered up to the moderator for the panel discussions. So we live at a time of accelerating forces of change: globalization, climate, demographic, and as we're talking about today, technological change. And there's a real danger that without intention, technology could simply harden some of the divides that are present and growing in our society. It could deepen the gulf between the digital haves and have-nots. But we at Urban have been using each era's best version of data science and research technology to help expand opportunities for almost 50 years. So in this moment, we prefer not to wring our hands, but instead think about how can we harness technology to be a positive force for opportunity and inclusion. And I want to thank our partner in this event today and all of our speakers and you here in the audience for joining us in that same spirit. Urban has long been a pioneer in building microsimulation models to answer policy what-if questions and building and manipulating large data sets to find insight, among other research techniques. And in recent years, under the leadership of our exciting Office of Technology and Data Science, we've harnessed new technologies for research. And we're now rapidly embracing the use of augmented intelligence like machine learning and natural language processing, predictive and big data analytics, as well as cloud-based high-speed processing to deepen our capacity to find insight and have impact. So clearly, technology is affecting us, like many of you will hear today, in how we do our work. At the same time, technology is transforming the work that we do, the society we study, the questions we ponder, the problems we face, and the ideas that we help to accelerate. For example, as advantages in robotics, machine learning, and AI change the nature of work in the US and globally, we're working on how to ready the needed workforce and how the new economy can provide sustaining work for the whole labor market. In fact, virtually every aspect of social and economic policy that we study at the Urban Institute is being reshaped by a wide range of new technologies, from healthcare to safety nets, housing to workforce, and much more. And even as change raises new issues, those technologies can be directed in service of solutions to the challenges of expanding opportunity and inclusion. For example, technology lets us think differently about how governments at all levels can engage with constituents and deliver services, how we learn and build skills, how we cultivate entrepreneurs and grow new businesses, just a few examples. From an equity and inclusion perspective, we must focus not just on the new set of challenges, but also on the new opportunities, the new tools that we have to address them. At the Urban Institute, our mission is to open minds, shape decisions, and offer solutions to the most pressing challenges of the day. And so that means we need to better understand a broad range of technological innovations and their consequences for the well-being of people and places. We need to find promising solutions, measure their impact rigorously, and help accelerate the ideas that work. So that's why we're so very grateful to the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth for helping us to deepen that understanding, for helping bring us together here today, and for helping us to launch a new Innovation for Inclusion program at the Urban Institute. In addition to the summit today, this new Innovation for Inclusion program, led by Senior Fellow Solomon Green with many collaborators from across the Institute, will start us down a path to generate new research on how local leaders can harness technological innovation to understand and address racial and economic inequalities in their communities. Later this summer, we'll offer a framework on this challenge and opportunities in 4 key areas: civic tech, smart infrastructure, shared mobility, and big data analytics. It will also allow us to collect and share insights on technology and equity from across the work on all the policy centers here at Urban, and launch a new webpage where these ideas and debate around these ideas will happen. Today, we're going to learn more about how local leaders can harness technological innovation to understand and address inequalities in their communities. We're going to highlight some creative uses of technology to directly tackle racial and economic inequality. We're going to hear from local leaders who've adopted innovative policies and built strong partnerships that enable public investments in technology to yield more inclusive outcomes. We have an incredible lineup of panelists who bring really diverse experiences and expertise to these questions. All of them are working to develop practical solutions to the challenges faced in their communities. They represent the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the public sector. We have technologists, innovators, advocates, social entrepreneurs, and academics. What all have in common is a focus on innovative solutions to one of the greatest challenges of our day: rising inequality along the lines of race and class in so many of our communities. So for that great challenge, we could have no greater partner than our friends at Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. And I'd like to invite our friend Sandy Fernandez, who's been a real leader in this work at Mastercard, to join us. Sandy is the Senior Director for Americas at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. He's a veteran of community innovation and inclusion work. I think we first met in I'm not going to mention the employers in between, but at one of his earlier gigs, but with the same focus on these communities and finding important solutions. He's worked to build national community and economic development programs, led coalition efforts with civil rights groups, and at MasterCard he works tirelessly to deliver innovative solution strategies and enabling research and policy that drives insights on economic mobility and opportunity in the nonprofit and for-profit center. My thanks to MasterCard and welcome to Sandy. Thanks all for being here.
Thanks, Sarah, for such the kind and generous introduction. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank all the staff at the Urban Institute, and also especially Solomon Green and his colleague Graham McDonald for all the work that they've done in their dedication to the work around the Innovation for Inclusion Partnership and all the other work that we've done together. I want to talk to you a little bit today about the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth and about some of the work that we do. The Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth addresses 2 of society's most pressing challenges: inequality and exclusion. We seek to advance sustainable and equitable economic growth and financial inclusion around the world. At the center, we're focused on connecting people to the networks that power the modern economy, which we believe can increase productivity. For example, we know that more than 1 billion people still live in extreme poverty, and hundreds of millions more face economic insecurity as the income gap widens in many developing and advanced economies. Research shows that connecting people to the vital networks that power the modern economy increase their productivity, catalyze equitable economic growth, and sustained poverty reduction. And these are networks like physical infrastructure, mass transit, roads, bridges, social networks, and also virtual networks as well. At the center, we're developing innovative ways to connect people to the networks and resources that enable them to thrive and prosper. And we call this democratizing productivity. We believe that the private sector has a unique opportunity and responsibility to make a positive difference, leveraging its assets for social good. On the commercial side at MasterCard, we're doing what we know best, which is building financial infrastructure, managing financial data to create lasting change. A little bit in terms of how we're set up. The non-commercial work of the center sits between the commercial efforts and the traditional philanthropy of the Mastercard Foundation. The foundation was established as an independent entity in 2006 with a gift of Mastercard stock at the time of our initial public offering. Today, the foundation invests more than $300 million in sub-Saharan Africa, while the center focuses globally. So while the business delivers commercial products and solutions, the center's focus on leveraging MasterCard's core assets to impact a broader set of issues affecting excluded communities. We leverage these assets to help people connect to the networks I just talked about, and we do that in 4 ways. what we call our 4 strategic pillars: research, programs, data philanthropy, and influence. Our first pillar on research informs everything we do at the center. We collaborate with leading research institutions, places like the Urban Institute, the London School of Economics, and Harvard University to advance actionable insights that the center and others, including governments and NGOs, and businesses can take and apply to make progress on inclusive growth. Our second pillar is about investing in programs. Here, we focus on activities and programs that increase the productivity of low-wage workers and entrepreneurs through technology, training, and financial products and services. Our third strategic pillar is a field we feel we're pioneering is around data philanthropy. This is the use of private sector data and analytics to address the growing information inequality gap between the commercial and social sectors. Our early work involves sharing Mastercard data with the likes of Harvard and NYU, which form the basis for research to grow tourism and leverage smart city innovations. And to date, we've made over $10.3 million in data grants to institutions. We've also promoted evidence-based insights using data. For example, our data scientists combine public and proprietary data to uncover new insights on the impact of crime on local businesses, as well as individual drivers of charitable giving. Now we're taking steps to position ourselves for private sector leadership on data philanthropy, and the Urban Institute is a key partner for us in this. There's going to be a forthcoming report that will feature case studies utilizing Mastercard anonymized and aggregated data on charitable giving and equitable economic development. We're helping to build the data analysis capacity of the social sector as well by collaborating with universities and NGOs to improve their capacity to make data-driven decisions and inviting renowned scholars to join the center as data philanthropy fellows to explore the social impact potential of our data with data scientists. And lastly, our fourth strategic pillar is about influence, in which we're connecting a trusted community of stakeholders and thought leaders to share opportunities, challenges, and solutions on inclusive growth. In North America, which is the area that I'm primarily responsible for, the center deployed an inclusive growth strategy about 2 years ago that's focused on improving the financial stability and growth of people and places by addressing the impact that the changing nature of work has on low-wage workers, growing small businesses that have the potential to drive job growth, and delivering insights on economic mobility in cities. This is not our only focus at the center, but also for our business. Earlier this year, our business in North America launched the Inclusive Futures Project, which will address challenges in 3 key areas: digital solutions to manage finances and speed payments, government services for greater innovation and efficiency, and smart cities for a digitally inclusive future. And you'll hear more about that from my colleague BJ Mahal, who's going to be moderating the next panel. Partnerships are critical for us. And I think for us, we are involved in a number of collaborative efforts with public, private, and civic society organizations around the world. And our partnership with Urban is particularly exciting as we explore inclusive growth strategies and opportunities that address and enable opportunity for all, which is why we're very proud to partner with you here at Urban in the Innovation for Inclusion Summit and all the work that's going to be coming out of this work stream. And we really look forward to the discussion. I'll encourage all of you to not only follow us on Twitter, but also to check out our website for some detail on the work that we've done at mastercardcenter.org. Thanks again for your time today. We're looking forward to the discussion. And with that, I'd like to invite my colleague, BJ Mahal, who leads our work on smart cities and urban innovation here in the U.S., to come up and open the next panel. So thank you.
First, thank you very much to the Urban Institute for hosting us. Really excited to have a diverse and very experienced group of panelists that bring together a rich background from the public sector, from entrepreneurship, from all around the country. Really innovative solutions that are moving the needles and where they're deploying their solutions. As Sarah alluded to, we live in a very interesting time. Technology, business models are rapidly changing. The way that we communicate, gather, disseminate information, the way we move, access transportation from point A to point B. Take Washington, D.C., for example. If you walk outside here, you potentially may trip over a line bike or a bird or the next new innovation that comes any moment now. So we live in a golden age, but we know that there's another side of that coin, that with this proliferation of new technology, that there are those that really aren't getting the upside, specifically along economic and racial lines. So we want to go and take a deeper dive into some of these innovative solutions and projects that are really going and looking at that angle to improve inclusive growth, provide more equitable development in communities, and then think about how we can get other folks part of that to scale those opportunities, deepen that impact. And without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. We have the founder and CEO of Propel, Jimmy Chen. And Jimmy's got an incredible background. One, he'll tell you more about his Fresh EBT app, which is a smart app that specifically delivers SNAP benefits. So it currently has about 1 million plus families using this, and incredible feedback, 15,000 plus 5-star ratings for that particular app. It's been mentioned in the New York Times, Washington, Wall Street Journal, Wired, financing backing from some of the stalwarts out there, Andreessen Horowitz, Women Yard Network, CFSI, Kevin Durant, Nas, and brings a rich history from experiences at Facebook, LinkedIn, Yahoo, as well as the World Bank. To his left, we have Matt Hoffman, who's the Vice President of Innovation at Enterprise Community Partners. And in that particular role, Matt's really focused on affordable housing and community development, thinking about how new products, programs, and policies can be instituted, specifically with a focus on helping those less fortunate access housing. And then brings also a diverse background as an entrepreneur himself in real estate, stints in both the public and private sector, in a capacity supporting the Secretary of Commerce as well as teaching elementary school. Very excited to hear about some of the work you're doing at ECP. And to his left, we have Kieran Jain, who is the Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel of Neighborly, which is a venture-backed company supplying public finance to critical infrastructure, supporting the way that people live, play, and work, providing two-way bilateral access to municipal bonds. And then she also previously was the Chief Resilience Officer of City of Oakland, founded the Civic Design Lab, and was also a founding attorney for the Asian Law Caucus. And lastly, but definitely not least, we have S.T. Mayer, who is the Chief Program Officer for Code for America. One incredible solution that she'll talk to you about is what they're focused on criminal justice with, I won't steal your thunder, but previously served in San Mateo County Health System as a Director of Public Health Policy and Planning, a span of roles at nonprofits with an emphasis on public policy, and serves on the board of the Human Impact Partners. So with that, let's go ahead and kick it off with Jimmy to give you a little bit of background on what Propel and what you're doing with Snap EBT.
Yeah, thanks, BJ, and thank everyone for being here and paying attention to us today. This is going to be a really exciting panel, I think. So at Propel, we try to solve a fairly small problem in order to solve a much bigger one. The small problem that we try to solve is that if you are a low-income American who receives food stamp benefits, or also known as SNAP benefits, you get them on an EBT card. It looks like this, looks like a debit card. But to go check your balance, you have to call a phone number on the back of the card and listen to a robot recording read the balance out to you. The bigger problem that we aim to solve is the fact that poverty is sticky. That when you're low income in the United States, there are not a lot of support services out there that are easily stitched together to help someone to get back on their feet. And in particular, that we think there's a bigger role that software and technology can play in helping people to kind of make that happen. So I grew up in a loving and supportive household that also had trouble putting food on the table. I was fortunate to go to Stanford on a full ride scholarship to study computer science and cognitive science, and then spent time working at a variety of Silicon Valley software companies like LinkedIn and Facebook. In 2014, I left Facebook with the idea that I wanted to take the playbook of companies like Facebook and Silicon Valley around how they build software and serve consumers and use that to fight poverty. So I moved out to Brooklyn to join the Robin Hood Foundation to do a fellowship program really focused on learning more about the daily challenges that low-income Americans face, and that was kind of where I learned more about the SNAP program and about this kind of card. The solution that we ended up building is a free app. It's called Fresh EBT. It works kind of like a mobile banking app for the EBT card. So in the same way that if you have a debit card from a bank, there's usually a free mobile app you can download that helps you check your balance, to see your transaction history. Maybe it helps you do things like set a budget or find investments. We do that for the EBT card. A lot of what we're trying to do is kind of make the EBT card feel more like a modern financial tool. We do a lot more in Fresh EBT than just help people see their balance and their transaction history. We also promote a variety of other services that help our users to improve their overall financial health. We start with things like, how do we help someone purchase groceries? That's a lot of what people are thinking about when they're using our app, is how do they have, how do they put together their next grocery shopping trip so that they can stock up food to keep feeding their families. So we partner with a variety of grocery retailers and grocery brands inside of Fresh EBT to help our users save money. We have these grocery coupons that exist inside the app that our users can clip as they check their EBT balances. And in 2018 alone, our users have clipped more than $4 million in grocery coupons from inside a Fresh EBT. The other kind of major thing that we do outside of just checking your balance is helping our users find jobs. So about 70% of our users tell us that they're looking for work. And to be clear, the majority of people who receive food stamp benefits in the United States already work. But it's just that a lot of our users are also looking to supplement their income with more part-time jobs, more shifts, or perhaps a change in their current job. And so we work directly with a variety of employers throughout the country, some more on a part-time and shift basis, and some more on kind of traditional full-time employment to help our users find jobs. So I'll wrap up with just a little bit more about who our users really are. As BJ said, we have more than 1 million people who use Fresh EBT throughout the country each month. We have users throughout all 50 states. And our users are disproportionately young, and they're disproportionately female. So about 83% of our users are women, and about half are under the age of 35. About 87% of our users have children at home. And so young mothers are sort of who we have in mind when we're building new features and thinking about how we can continue improving what we're building through Fresh EBT.
Thank you, Jimmy. That's incredible work you're doing with SNAP EBT and serving those that need it the most. I'd like to shift over to Matt. And Enterprise Community Partners is offering a similar solution, really, with providing better access to this critical information for those who need affordable housing. Can you elaborate on how this idea of your Resiliency app was conceived and how this fits into ECP's mission of really providing low-income people with access to housing and opportunity?
Sure. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Enterprise. And we really come from the analog world. And hopefully by the end of this panel, you'll see the convergence between kind of digital companies like Propel and traditional analog companies like Enterprise, or organizations like Enterprise, which was founded in 1982 by Jim Rouse, who's a renowned developer and urbanist. And our mission really is to connect low-income people to opportunity. Historically, primarily, that has been done through affordable housing, building, financing affordable housing, and those outputs are 500,000 plus units of preserved and built affordable housing, $36 billion of capital delivered. We own and operate 15,000 units here in the Mid-Atlantic and asset manage over 100,000 units. So we have touched a lot of lives, millions of lives in this country over the last decade or so. But we primarily have been thought of as a financier, a builder, a problem solver. Certainly in the policy markets, our kind of tripod is we focus on solutions, we deliver capital, and we work with policymakers at all levels, again, with the core mission of serving low-income people, in particular their housing needs. But we really have been focused over the last decade about how do we get beyond housing to connect people who we're serving to all the other resources they need to have the best life possible. And really that's what we're seeking for all Americans. We work exclusively domestically. So we've been oriented to the technology tools that are prevalent in all sectors now for the past decade. And the one that I'm talking about today is Resiliency, which is an app that anyone can download at resiliency.com or the Apple App Store or Google Play. I encourage you to do so. The purpose here was really threefold. First and foremost, we really wanted to create value for our residents. We knew that what was in our control was to deliver affordable housing through our own portfolio, the capital that we deliver, the policies that we're shaping, but also those of our partners. So we knew we know how to do that. We obviously still have a huge affordable housing, I'd say crisis is not an understatement, or not an overstatement, I'm sorry, it may be an understatement. But we know how to do the housing piece of it. The connection to opportunity, although we've known how to do that historically, technology really beckoned us with a new approach. And that was to operate at low cost, operate at scale, be able to pilot things quickly at low cost, experiment. But we knew where the people were because they're in these units. It's place-based, it's analog. The question was, how do we connect to them better? So the first piece was starting with the resident and saying, we know they need more than just the housing. So can we develop a tool or partner with someone to have a tool that connects them to these other resources, education, housing, transportation, job training, jobs, et cetera. The second piece is, how do we get better data about the people that we're serving so that we're either not just making assumptions, oh, poor people need X, Y, Z, but really understanding what their needs and, as importantly, what their wants are. And secondly, not relying necessarily on the best efforts of data collectors such as the government and other agencies who have great intention, but a lot of those data sets are somewhat archaic when you're making a decision today. The census data, the ACS data looks back. Sometimes, it can be 3 years is the best data set, the most recent data set you can get. And especially when you're dealing with housing, which is a very dynamic market, what's happened 3 years ago, for example, where rent rates were 3 years ago aren't necessarily don't reflect where they are today or where they're going tomorrow. So we really wanted access to better data. That was a second driver for us. And the third piece was that we really wanted the landlords and the community service providers who touch most of the residents, the low-income residents that we serve, to have better access to them, communication or service delivery. So we developed Resility, which is a platform. It's a free platform it's an app on the mobile phone, mobile-driven, that really provides, at this stage, it's not so much transactional as resource push based, so giving people access to information. This is kind of our beta testing of it. We've been in delivery for about a year now in 3 markets, starting in New York City, expanding to Cleveland, and most recently here in DC. These are relatively small test beds, so I would love to have a million monthly users like Jimmy to report back to you, but we're really still in the early testing stages, and we're trying to figure out what are the best deployments for people in this world where there's so much information coming at you. How do we help filter that for people who really do need access to these resources and the resources that are available? And also, how do we collect and use data in an appropriate way that is respectful of people's privacy, certainly, and how they want information about them to be used. So I'll pause there because we'll go into some more detail as the panel proceeds.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing, Matt. And as an immediate takeaway, download Resility, so get that download count up. We know, Karen, that capital is a huge constraint to investing and developing in these essential neighborhood revitalization projects. How does Neighborly facilitate that two-way communication to allow for this and then get citizens and residents in the ability to invest?
Absolutely. I'm just going to go into a few slides and introduce what Neighborly is about. So Neighborly is an online technology platform that helps a 200-year-old public finance market access finance to fund critical infrastructure like libraries, parks, municipal broadband, community solar. It's a $3.8 trillion market today in the United States that cities access to drive one of the biggest components of social equity, which is the public infrastructure we rely on to live, work, and play. We make it easier for cities to issue capital on our platform, but we also make it easier for investors to access those opportunities and make informed investment decisions. A few years ago, just to give a quick anecdote, there was a buycaliforniabonds.com website where you would go to try to buy a bond. And we went through the pages, and at the end it was, pick up your phone and call these 15 broker dealers. And we thought these barriers to entry were not only on the issuer side, but also borne by the investors. So our goal at Neighborly is to connect communities to this capital, to streamline the process and make it more transparent. So this is a picture of a bond that hangs in our wall in San Francisco at our headquarters. And it reminds us of a time when communities and banks in those communities would come together to finance the critical infrastructure that people needed. It also reminds us of a time when local architects and artists had a say in how we shape that infrastructure. The reason why the Golden Gate Bridge is orange was actually a community movement led by a local architect in Berkeley. So we want to go back to these basics, but we're also leveraging technology to make the process more seamless and efficient. And we see that with the growing 21st century needs that we talked about today, the types of infrastructure projects like municipal broadband, what we call the 21st century digital bridge, need more innovative financing solutions. We believe private capital is not the only answer, and that cities should have access to affordable capital to be able to make these projects a reality. So today, in this market, you have about $1 billion of debt issued. And it's a very cumbersome process. It's borne by a lot of middlemen. It could be credit rating agencies, investment bankers, counsel, bond insurers, the like. And a lot of the capital that you want to be going to these projects is also going to these middlemen. And so with our technology platform, the way we're making it more seamless and efficient, we want local communities like Salinas, California, for example, where we did a recent underwriting for a library and a 21st century learning center. We want that capital to go into the local hands and not into the pockets of these middlemen. And that's what our technology solution helps drive. We also have an investment manager that is developing an impact analytics stack, because what we're understanding from our users is that municipal bonds are like the original impact investment. And we want to be able to communicate that impact to them. And so we've developed this analytics stack to help people target the types of investment opportunities they'd like to source, but also then be able to invest in them. We know that we need to do more to be able to raise that capital and that finance to get to these projects. We are seeing a sea change in the types of projects that communities are interested in financing. As I mentioned, broadband and community solar have been two of the top priorities that when we were talking to issuers about what they would like to build a more resilient and equitable future. And so we want to be part of that financing solution, understanding, the governance structure, the technology that's there, whether it be broadband or something else, but that financing piece seems to be the one that's critical, that we can lend a hand and make cities be able to access the market more easily.
That's fantastic. Shifting over to ST, we know that Clear My Record also works on improving how students interface with the government. Can you tell us a little about the different needs it addresses and what you've learned through this process?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Of course.
So first I'll just tell you a tiny bit about Code for America. So actually, quick show of hands. How many people have heard of Code for America? Yes. All right, I love that. So we're only an 8-year-old nonprofit, and we're headquartered in San Francisco, so when I come out here to the East Coast, I never know, are people gonna know who we are or not know who we are? So that's fantastic. You've made my day. Thank you. So we're an 8-year-old nonprofit, and we work across the country, and we really work on what we call the principles and the practices of the digital age in government. So we have a government partner who says that efficiency in government is a matter of social justice, and we couldn't agree more. We think that really to deliver on the promise of our communities and to ensure that those people who are most vulnerable have the services that they need, we need a government that works. And that there's an opportunity in technology, both how technology is developed and the actual technology itself, to create better outcomes for vulnerable people, but really for everybody. So we work in a variety of areas, but I'm going to just focus on our criminal justice work. specifically on record clearance, because it's sort of one discrete stream of our work that I think is illustrative of the conversation here today. So, you may know, you may not know, but about 1 in 4 adults in the United States has a criminal record that would just show up on a routine background check. That's about 70 million adults that can experience up to 4,500 and some odd barriers to just sort of living their life at their full capacity and achieving full opportunity. And those barriers can run from an inability to get housing, both subsidized housing or just plain rental housing in a tight market where somebody's going to run a background check on you and not want to give you that rental because something shows up. Believe it or not, a cosmetology license requires a background check and in many cases can be denied. Student loans are not accessible to people who have some criminal background records on their background check. It can come into effect when you are going through custody battles. So just think of the sort of things that people need to do on life course and understand that a criminal record can really be an incredible barrier to achieving that opportunity. Fortunately, many states and local communities have implemented laws and policies that allow people to clear those records based on a variety of things. If they have already served their time or they have achieved some other kind of a remedy, you can kind of clear that record and have a new start or a new opportunity, right? And so those laws exist, and yet what we find is very few people take advantage of them. And so in California alone, if the estimates are 2 to 7% of the people who are eligible for those remedies have actually benefited from them or taken advantage of them. And California itself has some of the more generous remedies. Other states may have sort of narrower policies in that regard. So this is sort of a perfect, this is the kind of question that technologists love, right? Like the opportunity exists and yet people aren't taking advantage of it, and sort of like, why? And then sort of how can we do something about that? So we sort of studied the problem at Code for America, and initially really by following what we call kind of user research, but following people going through the process. And it was probably no surprise to those of us who know how government services work, but it's a really hard process to go through record clearance, like really hard. If you are a California resident, just for example, you are likely to have a criminal record in multiple counties. You have to go through a clearance process in every single county. It's a totally disconnected process. It starts with a paper form that you have to pick up someplace in person. You have to be able to understand and complete that form, which is not easy, particularly if you're not a lawyer, which most people are not. You have to figure out where to submit that form. You have to sort of follow up with that form, and then you have to go through a whole bunch of different sort of court dates and meetings and answer additional information, et cetera, right? In every place. So no surprise, communities come to understand the process is hard and don't waste their time and don't sort of bother going through that. And so it's just huge barrier upon barrier. Okay, I have a couple slides. So we started by taking all these processes online, creating just digital web forms, crosswalking all of the processes to the forms to sort of say what's the simplest form we can create, understanding the technology that low-income users, predominantly low-income people because they're not hiring lawyers to help them through the process, use, which is mostly mobile phones these days, and helping people kind of create in sort of plain language all those forms and then submitting them. And at first we were really excited about this. It seemed like we could help a lot of people really fast. And then we found that we could get a lot of people into a really narrow funnel, and then they would sit there. So we processed 7,000 applications in a really quick period of time, and all those people were in queue waiting for a public defender or a legal aid lawyer to kind of help them with this process, right? Big barrier. So that wasn't our goal. Our goal was to get people all the way through the process to have that kind of clear remedy. So we went back to the process that we had mapped out and came to understand that really the reason that the lawyers were required is because there's this thing called a rap sheet. And it's basically the public record of what's on your criminal record, right? It's what's on your, when a background check is conducted. It's the public record of that. And they're really hard to understand. They're codes and numbers, and the formatting is difficult, and they look sort of like a digital printout of a lot of codes and sort of shorthand. And so you need a lawyer to parse this and figure out what you're eligible for and what to do with that, what forms to figure out. So we thought if we could simplify that process, perhaps we could avoid the need for lawyers, and then we can move more people through that barrier. So we built a tool that does three things. First of all, you can take a picture of your rap sheet. So it just sort of reads that, right, using optic recognition. And then we built, so that's part one, take a picture, figure out what that actually says. Then part two is build an algorithm that sort of acts like a lawyer. It basically encodes sort of all the rules of the laws and policy that says, if you have this on your rap sheet, then you're eligible for this, et cetera. And tells you, returns to you a set of remedies, right? You can clear these records. Here's where you sort of stand. So it kind of digitizes the thinking that the lawyers were otherwise putting into this. And then the third part it does is it fills out all the correct forms. So, you could have a bunch of different codes on your rap sheet, and they all go into different forms. So it kind of prints those out. Imagine like a PDF writer, right? And so this seemed like a pretty good opportunity to move more people through that pipeline. And as we were developing it, we were presented with an opportunity that sort of catalyzed what we thought was possible in terms of record clearance. And so it turns out that actually in a lot of these policies, the government could just clear those records for people. You don't actually have to do something as an individual. Only in most cases, the government doesn't have the technology or know how to actually do that in kind of a batch way. And so we have now taken that technology, and instead of individuals being the main consumer of that, we're working with district attorneys, first around California and then around the country, to basically say, we can take in batch all of your criminal record data, we can run it through our logic and our algorithm, and we can return to you all of the forms that you need to be able to automatically clear those records. So when we think about government just presenting people with an opportunity for a fresh start, actually just taking the individual needing to take action completely out of the equation and allowing government to deliver on those policies actually becomes the greatest opportunity. It was through following individuals and how hard they were trying to go through this process and how many barriers they encountered that we actually were able to realize that there was a role for government here that could just accelerate this and deliver on that promise in a way that was much, much more robust than we had ever imagined. So I'll just pause there in terms of what the technology does. Maybe I talked a little long.
That is absolutely super cool. And I think this is a really good time to level set. You can see a variety of different systemic problems that innovative projects and solutions that the panels have presented are looking to solve, from criminal justice reform to access to capital to affordable housing and to delivering essential benefits to the most vulnerable. But there are a couple of themes I think kind of cross between all four of these. I want to dig a little bit deeper into that, specifically that they're all trying to help government do more with less. And the question that I pose, and I'll start with you, Karen, and then maybe go revert to Jimmy, is that as part of this process, did you guys liaise, work with government, whether it be at the federal level, the state level, or the local level, or was it something that kind of just happened? Was there coordination or independence, and did you expect government to kind of adopt this and use it as an augmentation of the service that they're already providing?
Yes, absolutely. So our work is really focused at the state and local level, and we have, I mentioned all of those different players within a bond issuance process. A lot of cities and public agencies will work with somebody called a Municipal Advisor, who we work with closely to understand what a city's needs are and how we can augment that by leveraging technology. And we see this important for a number of reasons, but mostly because we know that as the needs increase, the pie is not getting bigger for local government, right? So you are kind of in this design constraint of having to do more with less. And I remember my time in Oakland during the Great Recession when we saw service requests increase by nearly 30%, but our staff had decreased by 25% because of budget cuts. We knew that we had to kind of rethink the business of government. And so that's really important to us in partnering with folks, understanding government needs, where their pain points are, and how we can develop software solutions to help solve for that.
Jimmy, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on the same thing.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. We love working with governments at all levels, from cities to counties to states and think that we share a lot of the same goals. I mean, we really want to make the SNAP program more effective, and we are huge fans of kind of this critical support that a lot of low-income families rely on to put food on the table. And so we're really just invested in trying to make that better. I think we take kind of a non-traditional path towards doing that, because I think the more traditional way to think about improving the SNAP program would be to kind of sell official software to the government or to become the official front end or service provider of these programs. We sort of take a different approach, that we think we can actually provide a value add service on top of that. And our approach is really thinking about, the food stamp program creates these EBT cards that look like financial tools but that don't exist in the financial services realm. What if we were to take the things that have made financial services more user friendly when it comes to bank accounts and debit cards and prepaid cards, and apply that wisdom and that tech to the EBT card to kind of make it feel like a modern tool? And so, that's a way that I think we aim to kind of relate to this program as sort of a third party, but a third party who shares a lot of the same goals.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into this, because we know that it's absolutely essential for the private sector, not-for-profit sector, and the public sector to collaborate if we're really going to go and chip away at some of these really tough blocks. So I'd like to hear from some of the other panelists on, for those who are at government, what do you recommend some ways that they can partner with you to kind of go after some of these really bad issues? Yeah, please. I mean, yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I think especially in affordable housing, we have an interesting conundrum, but it's more budget driven than anything. So only about 25% of people who are eligible for affordable housing subsidy actually receive it, not because they can't access it or because of bureaucracy, but really because it's not appropriated. So we've authorized these benefits to people, but we haven't funded them. So I point that out because I think a lot of times in these complex systems that are government driven, the real challenge is that we've developed a solution that because of very valid reasons of fairness and equity, we construct very complex systems to deliver those benefits. That doesn't go to the budgeting piece so much. That's more of a kind of a political issue, I would argue. But as we kind of construct these bureaucracies essentially to deliver, which are constructed in large part to prevent fraud, so they're very cumbersome. Time marches on and new approaches evolve, but we've kind of constructed something that is not as agile and flexible that the new approaches, especially the newer technologies, can accommodate essentially. So I appreciate what Jimmy is saying about creating solutions that instead of trying to kind of hammer away at a bureaucracy or a certain construct for delivering a subsidy, for example, in affordable housing, kind of finding a complementary approach, and it doesn't necessarily have to be technology driven, that is a sidecar or an add-on that doesn't have to go through, especially a political process or an entrenched bureaucracy to get delivered. So I hope that isn't too negative a message, because I have served in government. I'm a firm believer that government is a good vehicle and has good intent. A lot of times we have, I think, conflicting goals to help people and to also kind of prevent abuse of systems that oftentimes we end up over-engineering towards preventing abuse, and that makes the service delivery suffer. So,
thank you, Matt. I want to kind of go and shift a little bit differently. We know there's immense opportunity for technology to include those who are excluded, but we also know technology could exacerbate that and further exclude folks. And Jimmy, I would love to kind of get your thoughts on how you're seeing that play out and what you're doing to mitigate some of that, to make sure that the technology, specifically in your realm with an EBT, is not excluding more people or creating a barrier.
One of the things we thought a lot about in the early days when we were starting the company was that most tech entrepreneurs solve a problem that they understand. And that creates a certain type of technology company, and that's why when I was a 27-year-old male who lived in San Francisco, my smartphone was like a magic wand. Like I could do anything I wanted through my smartphone because there were so many companies out there thinking of me as their core consumer and who they're trying to solve problems for. If I instead think to now who my core customer is now, which is a low-income person who's probably a mother and probably lives in a city, there are much fewer of those people who are out there starting software companies to meet their own needs. And so those folks these days have smartphones. Who's building the software that actually meets their needs? That's, I think, how we started thinking about what equity in this system really looks like is what is the smartphone and who gets the innovation of technology? Who gets the real benefit of that? And what would it look like if we were a company that took the playbook and the tools and the skill sets of Silicon Valley and applied that towards solving the problems that low-income Americans face on a daily basis? To directly address one of the issues around tech access, I think this is one of the things we think about all the time is, how do we make the safety net stronger for everyone? There's a program called the Lifeline program that actually enables all people who receive food stamp benefits, but also a variety of other benefits to get a free smartphone with the free data plan. So all of our potential people that we were trying to reach do have access or could apply to get access to a smartphone that has a data plan, and that's all you need to use our app.
And Karen, I would also like to get your thoughts on, are you seeing any evidence of the technology and the realm of capital and access to municipal bonds providing a divide for certain folks who would like to be engaged?
Yes, I think it goes back to the kind of structural nature of our work, right? So I mentioned broadband earlier, and kind of with the FCC's decision to kind of abandon net neutrality, where does that leave folks? You have a lot of private ISP providers, and they're more than willing to kind of control the power and the pricing in that market. And so we're coming and saying, well, broadband is just as essential to a household as electricity or water, and how can we make that more accessible? And that's where I think the public finance markets play a role, along with the government agencies who want to facilitate it. I do think it's just very fundamental what we're seeing, and the divide is not just in rural communities. We're seeing in urban neighborhoods as well. And so we think that greater access, just this basic infrastructural asset, is really critical when we talk about tech equity and bridging the digital divide. We need to have that infrastructure to support it.
And for Matt and ST, and feel free to go whichever one you wants to jump on this, but on a similar vein, how do you ensure that the work that you're doing doesn't provide inaccess?
Yeah, sure. We do a lot of things. I think that the potential is always there, right? That you sort of are creating a greater disparity among a population that is already, left out of a lot of opportunity, right? If you're talking about folks who have criminal backgrounds or have are justice-involved folks, and so some of the things that we do. First of all, I talked a little bit about user research, right? And we try to ensure that takes place in a variety of settings with a full cross-section of the folks who are eligible for the kind of services that we're working on. And it can look like online user research, where we're sort of following our users online, but it also can look like going and shadowing people who are sitting in legal clinics and intercepting them in line and sort of finding out how it is that they work and are navigating the system, and then what can we do to help make that simpler, easier, more understandable, or more dignified. We also often talk about by the time someone's kind of gotten through a long line and a cumbersome process, and they've gotten to that window or that appointment or that court date, right? They're so beaten down by that process that sort of presenting your best self and really engaging at that moment can be really, really difficult. So if you can kind of help people get there in a way that lets them feel dignified about the interaction, they're going to be more successful as they kind of move through that. So I guess I would say one, just like for us, user research is really, really critical, and just constantly having our eye on sort of who are the people that we're engaging and what are the circumstances of their life. I'll share maybe two anecdotes that I think illustrate that. One is, we did a lot of research on when are people motivated to clear their records. There's sort of a common perception that like maybe people just aren't motivated, like maybe it's not that big a deal, or they've sort of worked their way around it, or by the time they're eligible, which could be 10 years after they've sort of completed their service, this looks like a non-issue and it's like out of their mind, which just isn't true. And we found two big life events, a job opportunity, and that's when people want that record cleared then. Like that opportunity is in front of them, and they need that record cleared. And the second is children. when they become a parent, often for the first time, or they have an opportunity to interact with their children, they want a clean start. They want to start a new opportunity, right? So we can take that into mind and sort of think about how we're interacting at those moments that really meet people where they are.
So I'm going to take a little more of a philosophical approach, so bear with me here. Hopefully it plays out. So housing, is grounded in property rights, which are at the core, I would argue, of capitalism. And property rights are about zero-sum game. If I occupy a piece of property, then you can't occupy it unless I ask you to or allow you to. The digital economy is something completely different, right? Where the marginal cost of the next unit of software is effectively zero. And it's really that whole economy, our economy, where it's moving is really about the network effect or Metcalfe's law, where every additional node on the network increases the value of the whole network exponentially. And because we're limited on time, this is the philosophy that's really driving our work at Enterprise outside of the bricks and sticks that we do. Because what we're trying to help is our economy shift where the people that we're serving, low-income people who are traditionally excluded from the market rate economy due to lots of barriers, including digital divide, but where they're actually seen as assets. Getting them on the network adds value even to the most cutthroat capitalists because they are now part of this bigger economic system. So while we can spend a lot of time focusing on getting more smartphones into low-income people's hands, and that is important, and there are government programs like Lifeline which are very critical, we're about to see a huge transformation in technology with the advent of 5G. Which is the next version of wireless, or 4G, which many of your phones are working on now, and what that's going to enable in terms of smart cities and autonomous vehicles and all kinds of new applications. It's going to be critical that all communities are going to have access to that 5G, not only if they can pay for it, but if we shift towards this kind of inclusive approach, this network effect philosophy, then maybe we'll actually even see universal service for 5G, much like we see universal service for mail delivery today to every address.
Thank you. I want to really, it's incredible work across the panel here, but how do we go and really think about measuring that impact, quantifying that impact? We're talking about technology, we're talking about the data that we see as a derivative of that, we're talking about data science. There's so many data sources out there. So can you guys each just briefly highlight how you're measuring the work that you're doing and offer any thoughts on how we can maybe do that more effectively? And we'll just go down the line, starting with Jimmy.
Sure. We did a study with Harvard economists last year to take a look at how people spent their EBT benefits prior to using our app and then once they start using our app. The intuition was that it's hard to set a budget and to think about how you're going to spend down your benefits over a 30-day period if it's hard to go check your balance in the first place. So being able to more easily access your balance means that people can really, to the earlier point that I made about EBT being a modern financial tool, one of the components of that is people get more control over their balance and get to spend it how they, is a stronger fit for what they really want. And so what the Harvard study found was that we were able to help people basically to get the equivalent of 4% more in benefits per month through better setting a budget. And that 4% may not sound like a whole lot, but for somebody who receives 30 days of benefits, that's the equivalent of 1 extra day of SNAP benefits per month. And so for a free smartphone app that also costs nothing to the public sector, we think that that's a pretty strong way for us to measure the behavior change that we're actually driving through the app.
So with regard to Resility, which is our app for our residents, we're really at the early stages, and it's all the usual, click-throughs and what are they looking at, and so, but we're still early. What I would say more broadly at Enterprise, we've created something called Opportunity 360 because one of the things that we realized as we talk about connecting people to opportunity is that we didn't have great current data that was harmonized at the neighborhood level or the address level that could inform us well with regard to not just housing but education resources and all the other resources I mentioned before. So we've created a tool that pulls in both proprietary and public data and harmonize it by address. So Opportunity 360 is something that you can access through the Enterprise website, but that's really been our focus as well, is to try and present data, well, to ourselves, accumulate data, and present it to our partners and the broader community in a way that's very digestible, but also very relevant and current.
So I would say it's twofold for us. On the city side, we're looking at cost of issuance data and how our technology reduces that and what role it plays. And that's information that we share with some of our clients. And there's been several studies around that and how lower income communities are more punished in the capital markets and have a higher cost of capital and whatnot. And so we're illustrating that through the data platform we're building. On the investment side, I mentioned earlier this impact analytics stack, and what we've done there is we've taken the traditional kind of credit evaluation criteria and married it with other pieces of data that you might not necessarily consider in an underwriting, and it could be around voting records or high school readiness or different types of things, and thinking about what role predictive analytics could play in evaluating these credit opportunities and sharing that information out with our investors.
Right.
Interesting. So we look at this in a couple of ways. For Clear My Record specifically, obviously there's just counting people, right? How many people, how many records were cleared, and for how many people is that a complete remedy? And it's part based on sort of the strength of the algorithms that we can write and how all that can mirror the laws, and it's also part sort of how generous are the laws. And so there's a piece of our work that is also sort of really about actually trying to get those laws to be more and more generous, right? Turning the conversation from we can't to we won't, and then addressing those political won'ts sort of head on. And that's just a pure count of records and people. But then the other is we really don't want to push any more cost onto government. Government, we really want government to be able to do more with the shrinking budgets that we've sort of all acknowledged, and sort of having a platform that's about like we need more people in government. Isn't necessarily going to build that partnership that we need with government right now in particular. And so we look at sort of what would be happening if we weren't there. For Clear My Record specifically, there are some district attorneys that are committed to clearing those records auto expungement, even if we didn't have the technology. And what they do is they are basically having their staff work overtime. They're hiring a lot of attorneys to help sort of process these applications. In San Francisco alone, we think we'll be able to clear the bulk of records the district attorney is committed to in about 3 months, and they were estimating years before we were there. And so we can kind of look at that staff time and calculate sort of what that cost would be to the public sector. And obviously we come in far, far lower of that given the cost structure of technology that was mentioned.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to transition now to opening up the questions to the greater audience, both in attendance and those online. So if there's some, please. And we'll have a mic come over to you so everyone can hear.
Hi, my name is Kartik, and thank you all for your comments today. Obviously doing amazing work and very inspiring. Just want to understand, how do you monetize the different sort of applications and technology platforms to make it sustainable?
Sure, so I can start on that. We are a private sector company that does not charge our users anything, and also we don't sign revenue generating contracts with any government, so we don't take taxpayer dollars. Our customers are the organizations that provide services that help low-income Americans to improve their financial health. And we only get paid when we're able to help someone access those services. What that means in practice is, we have grocery coupons inside the app. We get paid each time someone clips a grocery coupon. We have jobs inside the app. We get paid each time we help place somebody in a new job. In general, we aim to be a platform that helps low-income consumers identify the services that aim to help them to get back on their feet, and we want to get paid kind of in accordance with helping our users to achieve their own financial goals.
And for Resility, the business model currently is that it's free for users, and the paying customers are local governments, service providers, landlords who are looking to build a community and access those people. So we are aggregating eyeballs, and people who can serve those eyeballs in accordance with the mission and values that we have are our prospective customers, paying customers.
And so we have a traditional platform. So on the investment manager side, it's BIPs on AUM, and then on the underwriting side, our broker dealer will have a fee. It's about 50% lower than the traditional market.
And we're a nonprofit organization, so like all nonprofits, we've got foundations and individual donors, and then we also have government contracts, not for this particular tool, but for some of our work as well.
Thank you very much. That answered your question? Great. And for those watching via the webcast, please do submit your questions to events@urban.org. And again, that's events@urban.org. So please keep the questions coming. Right over there.
Hi, thank you. So earlier you were talking about the introduction of 5G, and I was wondering if you could speak more about that, since I know that it's going to be introduced in the near future, and they're trying to push policy on that, and how that can lead to a more equitable society, because it does have a cost that goes along with it.
Sure. So I'm not a telecom expert, first and foremost, so if there are any in the room that want to correct anything I've said, I'm open to that criticism. But generally I'd say that 5G is a big infrastructure investment. It's being rolled out by all the major telecom carriers, the wireless carriers primarily. Verizon has a very big rollout in Sacramento. Most of them have pledged to some kind of equitable rollout. There's no mandate for that. We're talking about, I believe, hundreds of billions of dollars of new infrastructure. It's all new, primarily new, kind of not cell towers, but the cells themselves. They've got to be a lot more of them. It's going to be very expensive. So the question is, as a private company, like all the carriers are, they're going to go to markets first, neighborhoods specifically, that can pay for that service. Although it is, you're serving customers who want to go everywhere, so from an infrastructure standpoint of view, that infrastructure will have to be pretty widely deployed. At the same time, the devices and other applications that use 5G, there could be charges there. So again, it's kind of, the point that I'd like to make, especially representing the social sector, is that we've got to be highly attuned that this new technology, which is really going to be transformative because the amount of data that it can carry and the amount of sensors and other things that collect data that it will enable to come online is really going to be the kind of transformative factor to the economy that I was talking about before. I think will be noticeably different. And so for those of us that are focused on low-income people, low-income communities, we want to make sure before that's rolled out that we're at least at the table articulating those concerns, those needs, and I think more importantly, the more positive message of the opportunity of inclusion of lower-income people who may not be able to pay some kind of upfront or barrier fee, but if they're on that network and you believe in this network effect model, that there'll be a much higher return and much richer economy because of that inclusion.
I do think that the 5G conversation taps into a larger conversation that's happening within all of our cities, right? And that's the reimagining of the public right-of-way. I mean, you're seeing what's going on, not just with 5G. You mentioned Lime and Bird, and smart sensors, and how we're measuring cities, and measuring impact. And I think that intentionality around the policy making that Sarah mentioned in her introductory remarks, I think is really critical to this conversation. We know what the technology can do. We know who it could benefit and who it can if we make the wrong policies. And so I think it's really incumbent upon the local policymakers to drive these conversations, knowing that there are certain restrictions, right? You can't lease public right-of-way in California. You can't charge rent for that. But there's other ways you can be able to recoup some of that value and have that capture be able to benefit the entire community. And I think we just have to start drilling down and bringing the policymakers along with these technology solutions. And that's, I think, something we haven't really touched upon too much today, is that they're so critical in this process as well around the equity conversation.
Yes, please, on the front row.
Just to add, I do have a question, but just after the 5G conversation, I think a good example is to look at San Jose. They just had a huge announcement about their negotiations with the telco companies, and they were able to get, I think, around $24 million to put towards digital inclusion initiatives. So I think in addition to policy making and making those critical decisions, also about how we negotiate with the companies that are coming up against cities. So I do represent municipal government from Philadelphia, and one of the questions I had for you all is about workforce and the impact on our existing workforce and the future workforce. I just recently had a conversation with someone who works in adult education, and they were really upset that we were investing in learning about machine learning and applications in city government because they really believe that that's going to replace jobs. And so we talk about these really arduous processes and having to hire loads of people in. I think I'm louder than this. No worries.
Just keep going.
Got it. Okay. So, my question is, how are you addressing that part of inclusion when there are people here that are in our cities and in our communities that need these jobs and may not ever get trained in the new technology, and some of this technology might actually be replacing those jobs?
Yeah, who wants to go tackle that one first?
Yeah.
So I know the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act that was passed under President Obama was trying to tackle some of this. And what does 21st century job training look like? And the workforce development boards that a lot of municipalities have are all trying to answer this question, right? So you have the traditional model of, here's where we see job sector growth. This is where we're going to put our federal dollars to local impact. Now, there's, at least during my time in Oakland, there was a conversation around, well, is it just like a specific type of job, or are we training for different skills, that can make you more agile in this new economy? And I think that cities are still trying to figure that out. But one of the conversations we had was around, maybe it's not, a community college, maybe it's these badges you get, like you're going through these different skill training opportunities and you get a different badge for whatever that might be. Because I think you can't deny the fact that technology is evolving and that we have to evolve with it. And what does that look like from a job opportunity perspective is, I think, where the conversation needs to go. Instead of saying we're going to be displaced, it's how can we benefit from that growth?
We have one over here on the front row.
This question's more for Jimmy, but I'd be happy to hear all of your thoughts. You worked at Facebook and a lot of tech companies in the Bay, and I guess one day you thought, why can't I use the technology I'm using now to make a difference for more people and help inclusion and equity? How do we get more young people to take a path like you did?
I appreciate the question, and I don't know that I have a super well-packaged answer for you, unfortunately. I mean, certainly one thing that I aim to achieve through Propel is to be an example, to the extent that it is possible to build a profitable company that actually has a positive financial outcome, that doesn't compromise on its social mission, and that is fundamentally a mission-driven company. I don't know that we have that many examples of that in the economy today, and so that's one of the secondary effects that I hope to achieve through this company, is to just sort of show that it's not an either or, like choose to have social impact in your career or choose to make money and be sustainable, that there's actually a decent way to do both. I think all four of us on the stage are kind of examples of that, and so I think that's really to me the clearest way to push it forward is to have more examples of what success here can look like.
Absolutely, we have one right here in the third row, and then we'll go back to the fifth row afterwards.
Hi, so a lot of inequality in the United States is not only in cities, but also in rural areas, especially areas in the South. And a lot of those areas don't necessarily have the technology to basically utilize the same apps and stuff that y'all are making. So what lessons can rural towns, local governments utilize from what you all have done to harness technology in their areas?
So we do a lot of work, again, in the analog world of building and preserving affordable housing in rural and Native American communities. So we are embedded there on the ground with people. We understand their lives, understand their stories. Technology over the last 30 years, there's been a lot of promises delivered to those communities, or not delivered, a lot of promises made to those communities that technology would deliver, distance learning and telehealth and remote working and things of that nature. And some of them have probably come true, and but I think it probably has not played out. But to go back a little bit to the workforce issue, because I think they're related, I don't think technology is the enemy of those rural areas. I think, as someone who's been in economic and community development for a while now, I think that any community, whether it's rural or even an isolated neighborhood of poverty within in a wealthy region has to look at its core assets and say, how do we build off of these assets, and not try and replicate what Silicon Valley is doing or New York City, but really say, what do we have here that might be cultural? It may be intellectual, it may be agricultural, and not technological. That certainly technology will play some role, but that it can't be, we want to take that solution that worked in a very tech-focused way over here and say, we're going to apply it here, and it didn't work. I don't think anyone should be surprised. But focus on the assets that are in place and build off of those.
And moving right back to the fifth row.
Hi, I'm Samson Williams. As we talk about tech and inclusion, what is your strategy for addressing the changing demographics of America, particularly around Latinos and just Spanish-speaking or Spanish language materials?
Well, I can quickly answer that from Resility's perspective. I think we offer over a dozen languages just selected by the user. So certainly Spanish, but Russian and a lot of another 10 or so languages which are listed on the site. So that's one of the beauties of the technology. Talk about leveraging an asset, you basically code it once and it's an API that translates it. So we're able to be far more inclusive than if you were printing something, for example. So I think that that highlights the power of technology at a very low cost to potentially, if it's applied right, be more inclusive. You've probably seen the same thing.
Sure. I mean, yeah, at a basic level, we offer the app in Spanish as well. We have a Spanish speaker who's full-time on staff who not just translates the app, but also answers customer service emails in Spanish. We have something like 5-ish% of our users are using the app in Spanish full-time. I would actually be open to any feedback about how we can do better. I think there's always opportunity to kind of make our platform more inclusive and a better fit for the people who want to use it. So if there are ideas or organizations out there that are providing really great services for Spanish-speaking Americans who receive SNAP benefits, I think we'd love to speak with them.
Do you translate finance into non-finance language for people? You mentioned BIPs before, and I don't know.
Right. So it goes back to usability, right? And we were talking about this earlier. There was a digital service we had that was like at the 22nd grade reading level, and we brought it down to 8th grade reading level for multiple reasons. But one of them was translation services, right? Making that more seamless and easier to use. Our goal is to take that kind of wonky language, and I should have explained BIPs as basis points, and make it really accessible to the end user.
I'll add something to that actually, which is like a slightly different angle. And we also, all of our services are translated English and Spanish, and then other services, different languages depending on who we're serving and where. But what we've actually found is that really the cultural competence of trying to reach our users starts way before they actually get to our site or get to our service. And so in particular, actually trying to reach monolingual Spanish-speaking clients, what we've actually just found is something like running digital ads is not particularly effective. So they're searching for services at far lower rates, and their click-through from searching is much lower than for English-speaking. And so we actually have to convert people from other channels. So actually in-person for us is a really good conversion. So for services for in particular, we found people are more likely to go to like record clearance fairs, or a community center, look at a flyer, a trusted friend, and then if they get that information and they get the website from that person or that source, then they're going to come to our site, they're going to follow through, they're going to complete the service. But actually trying to find them online has been far less effective than actually trying to find people in other venues and then drive them to the service. So that's something that's been a learning for us in terms of thinking about how we're reaching people outside of the traditional, kind of tech channels where you think like, oh, you just buy a Google ad and then you'll find your people and then your people will go through your service. We're going to disproportionately find a certain group of people, which is English speaking in this case, and not a certain group of people.
Excellent. Probably have time for maybe 1 to 2 more. We have one in the back over here.
Hi, I'm behind the pillar, so I can't see some of you, but I'm wondering what your relationships are like with local governments, for those of you that do have relationships with them. And then if you do, what can local governments, city or county governments, do to be better partners to technology users or developers in the community who are working towards social issues?
So we take the position at Neighborly, we're here to kind of empower those entrepreneurial bureaucrats, and we want to be able to make their lives easier with our technology platform. And so we find that our clients have been very responsive to what we can provide them, but also how they can do their jobs just more effectively. So I think, Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example, where we did a recent deal, we worked with the city. They wanted to have a certain bond issuance available to all zip codes in their community, and we worked with them on a marketing campaign to make sure, again, meeting people where they are. It's not about the technology, it's like how you access it and deliver on that promise. And so there were bus stop ads and other radio show interviews and whatnot, some more non-traditional things, and we worked with the city on that so they could develop the campaign they really wanted to deliver on for their community.
I can add to that a little bit. So I think one thing is to say we just really try to make the technology not scary. And I can just, from personal experience, I joined Code for America 2.5 years ago. Before that, I was like, I'm not a technologist. Now I say I'm a technologist because I work for a technology organization. But that transformation was it's just a matter of time. It's not like I, learned to code in that time at all. But the difference is when you're immersed in a technology world, it just becomes familiar to you and it's not scary. And when you're immersed in government, that's not your primary focus. That's not how you spend most of your time. Policy's not scary to you because that's what you deal with all the time. Technology is scary because it's that thing you outsource to the IT department, right? So I think any of us who are sort of working in technology or in government, it's just incumbent on us to kind of make those two worlds not scary to the other, and in particular, make the technology really, really basic and friendly and understood. And not try to sort of make it this scary unknown. The other thing I want to just kind of give as a tip or a call to action for anyone who is working in local government, which is think about how you put your technology or whoever's responsible for your technology as close to your program work or your outcomes or your goals. Whatever you're trying to achieve, whoever's responsible for achieving that thing that you're responsible for, that you want to do, that you want to change, put the technology people, whoever's responsible for technology, as close to them as possible and have them work together. Because I just think there's this tendency in government to sort of identify the goal and the outcome and what it is you want to do or what you want to improve or what you want to make better, and then get it all figured out and then call the technologist, now do this thing for me. And you're just going to be way, way more successful at having technology help you achieve your goals if they're there from the beginning, kind of working alongside the policy or program or sort of other people who are responsible for that. And that's part of the sea change that we're trying to make happen.
And that's a great place to wrap us up. I want to thank our panelists for sharing their experience and the great work they're doing.
Good afternoon. We're going to transition very quickly here into the second conversation of the program. I understand you've been sitting quite a bit, so we're going to try to be as dynamic as possible. Some treats are waiting for you next door, so we're between this and them, so we're going to try to get jumping here and being as dynamic as possible. I'm pleased to be the moderator of this second panel discussion. My name is Gustavo Velasquez, and I am the director of Urban Greater DC. Urban Greater DC is a program here at the Urban Institute that focuses on studying and proposing solutions for some of the most pressing social and economic challenges facing the communities and the neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. and the Greater D.C. Region. And speaking about local communities and localities, this discussion that we're about to have will focus on highlighting innovative local policies, and I know the first panel started getting into that conversation about partnerships with local governments, so that's what we will be mostly focused on, that support tech equity and inclusive processes or partnerships to engage local communities in the co-design of technology and smart cities plans. If you Google today smart city plan or smart city initiative, you notice that there are a number of cities that are now beginning to sort of ingrain programs focused on smart cities within their bureaucracies, and so this field is obviously evolving quite rapidly. And I was actually recently at a conversation with the business community here in DC, and their business community is getting very interested in focusing on large macro regional strategies of smart cities. So that's very exciting as well. This panel is designed to help participants think creatively about how city leaders are harnessing technology to tackle inequalities, advance existing equity goals that most cities, if not all cities, already have, and better understand the equity challenges that their communities face. Hopefully we get to also talk about this issue of peer learning, peer networking between cities, and how cities are communicating with one another, learning from one another about technology, the intersection of technology and equity. And at the broader scale, let's say how it is that city leaders have to understand that technology is a means rather than an end in and of itself. New technology initiatives must adapt, must be aligned with the values of a community, and they should be accessible and advantageous to everyone, to every sector of the community. More importantly, we must remember, and this was said from the very beginning of the program, that technological forces are not inherently neutral. We've seen cases of technology and bias and discrimination. So we can not only rely on market forces, because that would potentially impact communities in different ways. Self-driving vehicle, for example, may be a groundbreaking and very exciting evolution in an urban dense area, but may inadvertently cause a prominent sector of the economy in a less dense area, in a rural community, to be affected. So we have to begin this conversation by acknowledging that values and priorities must precede the adoption of technology, and we ensure that community values are at the center of the debate with local leaders, elected local leaders and local government officials around city tech innovations. And we have three exceptional experts to talk about this conversation. You have their bios in your program, but I'm just going to briefly introduce them to you. We have first Joy Witt, who is an economic intelligence analyst at the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, commonly known as DEMPED, here in Washington, D.C. She works on open data APIs and visualization and analysis projects utilizing real estate affordable housing and business development data. Thank you, Joy, for joining us. Ellen Juan, is that how you pronounce it? Juan is the Assistant Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Office of Innovation and Technology with the City of Philadelphia. I love Philly. I used to live there many years ago. In this role, she's responsible for managing and leading the development and implementation of the city's first smart city strategy for Philly. And last but not least, Rajit Ghani, who is the Director of the Center for Data Science and Public Policy and a Senior Fellow at the Harris School of Public Policy and the Computation Institute at the University of Chicago, although to me the most exciting title that you've ever had, it was Chief Strategist for Obama for America. That's just my take on it. I want to remind everybody that we encourage you to share the conversation via social media, and if you do so, to use the 2 hashtags that you see on the screen, Life@Urban and Innovation for Inclusion, innovation number 4, inclusion. And we're gonna have a very conversational dialogue here, and then we'll turn it over to you for the last 15 minutes or so for Q&A. For those who are watching via webcast, we remind you to submit your questions at events@urban.org. And as we agreed before the program, we're going to start with some brief introductions describing, your work, what you're doing. So, Joy, let's start with you describing what you're personally working on, what DEMPET and the City of Washington, D.C. is working on. And one of the things I noticed reading your bio is that you've been very focused on involving really a diverse group of voices here in the nation's capital to have a dialogue about tech applications and tech innovations and equitable access. So when you describe what you're doing, if you can dive a little deeper into the aspect of community engagement that has been central to your work.
Sure, thanks a lot. So I wrote my first line of code about 4 years ago. I didn't have a background in tech before that, and I learned through organizations that were completely led by women and people of color, such as Hear Me Code and Tech Lady Hackathon. And they were all free, beginner-friendly for women and non-binary folks here in DC. And that was very important to me when I was looking for my first job in technology, having something accessible for me. And so I've been working with the government of DC in the mayor's office since I think it was fall of 2015, so about 2.5 years. And full disclosure, because it's still my first job in tech, I can't compare private sector tech. I don't know how technology works outside of local government, DC mayor's office. I know it's different. I just don't know where. And so,
it's binary.
Yeah, right. And so, yeah, I'm in a really unique team in the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development's office. It's a small team. There are 3 of us on the Economic Intelligence team. It's led by the Chief of Staff, who also MIT grad, CFPB background, and he just is this, I don't know anyone else like him. He is this guy who says, I'm going to merge tech with policy and local government, and we're going to be scrappy about it, and we don't have a budget, but we're going to figure it out. And so our office has been charged with 3 goals to uplift the affordable housing units in DC, to increase jobs, and to increase the tax base through business development. And so my position in this office is to do a lot of data visualization, data analysis on these key metrics. So making weekly dashboards for internal use, also making almost all the dashboards publicly available through GitHub pages and public free pages, because we have a budget, and definitely working with Code for DC, Code for America's brigade, all of the time. We're very close. Another aspect of my job is to ensure that we're putting on tech inclusion initiatives. And so I put on a lot of hackathons that are specifically accessible to women and people of color who are and have beginner-friendly courses at these hackathons. So I love that I'm able to do something full circle, and I got my start in civic technology beginner-friendly lessons, and I'm able to turn that around. And the very first hackathon I went to, called Tech Lady Hackathon, I'm currently a co-organizer for it, and this will be my third year doing that. And so it's been great. So we're merging a lot of the private sector, the local government, and community organizers in the city.
How hard or how easy has it been to organize these hackathons? Knowing DC a little bit.
I have a passion for the hackathons, and that's what drives me. I think the first time I realized how really challenging it was showing other agencies how to run a hackathon. They thought they could throw it together in a week or so and just get some data together and put on an event. I care about them a lot, so I always say I need 3 months to plan a solid hackathon. It's difficult, but it's nice to have full control over projects that are coming in. I want projects that focus on people of color, of women, of LGBT communities, and I want, because when you get projects that focus on these different identities, you're going to get people who want to attend these events and work on these projects as well. So yes, long story short, it's not difficult or not easy, but it's very rewarding.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, thank you, Joy. Ellen, your work in Philadelphia. Why don't you describe what you've been focused on? One of the things that I would imagine in your role is, or you have 3 sectors that you bring to the table. Well, 2 actually. The government is one, which would be you, and then you have the tech providers, the innovators, and then you have the community. And I wonder, grappling with sometimes what may not be tension, but different interests, different agendas. Grappling with that. I think from a perspective of the city, is something that probably you've experienced. So just describe in general what you work on and what is Philadelphia. How is Philadelphia advancing this agenda?
Sure. So I'm part of the City of Philadelphia's Central IT Department, which is the Office of Innovation Technology, OIT. And we are truly the strategic arm to all other city departments. And so whether it's hardware, it's software, everything else in between, that's something that our department is responsible for. And within the Central IT Department, we have a team called Innovation Management. That is the team of which I am a part of. And there are 4 of us, and we are primarily responsible for creating opportunities for departments to be more cross-departmental in their approaches to project implementation. We're also responsible for providing professional development opportunities around a design method called human-centered design thinking. And we're also responsible for creating strategic plans and opportunities for different departments to have the capacity to think about their strategy behind how they're approaching their problems. So the team that I'm a part of actually is not very technical in terms of none of us code. So I'm totally with you. But what we do is we try to diversify the amount of perspectives that are at the table when we are looking at trying to solve an issue. And that really starts with problem framing. And when we talk about smart city in Philadelphia, there's that the industry jargon around it being around information and communication technology and how that all integrates and big data and all that good stuff. They throw in things like Internet of Things and sensors. But when I look at smart city, it's really about how does technology actually support the way in which we're solving the problems that have been government's problem for decades and decades and decades. So our problems aren't necessarily new. They might be new in nature, but they're not necessarily new overall. And we have a lot more new tools and new types of partners in our community, both locally at the state level, federally and internationally, that we would like to pull from to figure out how we can look at the same issue maybe in 10 different ways instead of just one. And as we're doing this work in Smart City, we're trying to develop a roadmap that focuses a lot more on people, place, and process, more than it is about things. So things that project. So we talk a lot about air quality sensors, and you've heard a lot about autonomous vehicles already, and mobile applications. Well, those are all things that could be an outcome of a much deeper conversation around really understanding our constituents. That's both residents, businesses, as well as visitors. and really going down to all the way to the foundational level of how is city government being an effective partner to making sure that we are addressing all these different challenge areas in effective ways. And maybe at the end of the day, that leads to us being like, well, we really need to invest in autonomous vehicles. But it's really that process that leads us to getting to that place of knowing where we need to place our investments on. So I'll definitely, give a nod to the previous panel. Actually, a lot of the things they said really resonated with me because that's the way our team really thinks. We also have a really strong Code for America Brigade in Philadelphia, Code for Philly, and I believe 2 folks from Philly are actually on the national board now, which is really exciting. And part of building partnerships is trying to create lower the barriers and create pathways for city government to actually interface with these folks, kind of on neutral playing field, and be able to share what our challenges are. Government transparency is not only a best practice now, it's a necessity. People want to know what we're up to, they want to know why we're making these decisions, and they want to know how they can help. And that requires us to have a bit of vulnerability on our part, but also, have our things together to make sure that we're presenting it in a way that's accurate.
Right. Great. Thanks, Ellen, for that introduction. And Raid, you bring, much of the cross-cutting perspective. You have helped people like Joy and Ellen and others in other cities, nonprofit organizations, identify equity concerns in their cities and think through policies to address them. So explain more what your focus of work is and what have you observed about these policies and changes that support inclusion in your work.
Yes, I mean, I've got the luxury of judging cities on what they do without being in one of them. So it's a really nice position to say, you should fix this and then go away. No, just kidding. So, and I think that's what the usual perspective of, that's what people think academics do, right? We just sort of tell people what to do, write papers, and then go away. And what we're trying to do is change that, right? That's not what academia is. That's not what universities are designed to do. They're designed to train people while being very collaborative with the societies around them and have an impact. And so that's what we've been building at the University of Chicago is the last several years. So the activities that I'm involved in there are 3 buckets. One is really collaboratively working with cities, counties, states, federal agencies in the US and globally on data-intensive problems around policy issues ranging from health, education, sustainability, criminal justice, public safety, pretty much everything across the board. And so that's kind of one bucket. Second is a lot of focus on training. I live in a university, so that's our kind of core mission, right? And so trying to both educate students in how to do this more effectively, how to collaborate with governments and NGOs, how to be trained in all the different disciplines that are today typically siloed, right? People are living in the policy world and can't code, but should learn to code because it makes you a much better person. Not that you're not wonderful already, but you'd be even more wonderful if you learned to code. Everybody should. It's a basic life necessity. So people living in policy worlds, people living in tech world, stats world. There's a bunch of plants in the audience for a master's program that we run across computer science and public policy that we think, that's the future of what policy people look like. And ideally tech people having an awareness of policy issues out there, even if you're in the private sector. We also run the same programs for people in government, training them how to do scoping problems, how to think about problem definition. When there's a more analytical, data intensive solution there, you don't have to be the one solving the problem, but you should learn how to break it down in a way that is solvable very collaboratively with both sort of tech people and policy people in the same room. The third bucket of work that we do is looking at doing these projects sort of at different levels of government, at different policy areas, kind of detecting common missing, sort of common gaps. And one of them is around sort of we're noticing is there's a lot of conversation happening around equity and inclusion, but it's all very hand-wavy, right? Every politician stands up and says, I care about equity. They could not define what equity means for them, right? Mm-hmm. And so the conversation starts at equity and ends at equity, but doesn't come down to the level of okay, you're going to provide a service. That service is going to have to be measured in terms of today. You're probably measuring, if you're a city agency, in terms of money, its efficiency. That's your metric. You talk about equity, but your metric is still typically how much money did we spend delivering the service. And so I think what we've been doing is kind of looking at it, bringing that conversation a little bit lower, and I'll talk more about that later, is how do we break it down into different components of equity? How do we measure each component? And how do we identify the gaps in the equity that you need to fill in order to be much more analytical about it? Because today we're using data to mostly provide efficient services. We need to move towards more effective services and more equitable services. And I think the same technologies that we've been talking about around all the buzzwords, machine learning, AI, pick your current favorite word, are as useful in creating and enabling equity as they are in providing the efficiency part. So that's one example of the cross-cutting work, but there's a bunch of other things we do that are building open source tools for governments to start from, as opposed to beginning from scratch every time and build on top of problems that they're facing every day, as opposed to them kind of buying an off-the-shelf commercial tool and then trying to figure out, how do I customize this in what I need, because it's not exactly what I'm looking for.
So using the argument you were making about government leaders talking about equity for the sake of equity and needed to be more grounded, more analytic and specific about that, I was thinking this morning, wouldn't it be great to sort of exemplify this topic of, how do we solve equity challenges through technology? And I thought, you can take many fields that local governments are working on, but one that sort of stuck to me was public safety. And I made the mistake of thinking that you had work in the area of predicting policing, but I know that you have worked with police departments, and so can you give us a little more flavor about, let's take one field like public safety, how does it work?
Yeah, I think when we think about sort of police departments and data, most of us think of predictive policing as kind of the canonical example of how police departments are using data, and that's fair, because the media picks up on exactly that type of thing, right? It's so there are a couple of things around predictive policing. Right? One is that luckily most departments don't use it. We're really lucky they're not using it, because the technology is not horrible. The people who are sort of developing it are sort of detached from the actual communities and the problems they're facing, that and from the data that's being collected. It's sort of one of the problems around a lot of these tools, right? So what happens is predictive policing takes crime data and assumes that it's perfect. And we know that crime is one of the messiest data sources out there, because you only know crime happened if somebody reported it or if police happened to be around. A lot of crimes get unreported. A lot of places are not policed. Some places are over-policed. And so we get this horrible data that we start with, and then we assume it's perfect. And then we just reinforce this prediction, right? We just keep going and going and going. The results, we all know what they end up being. The worst thing is that police departments won't quite understand that that's what's happening. So they go in looking for crime in places, and guess what? Wherever you look for crime, you find crime. And there's a really good video. I think it was done by Vox. It's like a reporter sitting down with the police chief of Santa Cruz in a police car. Santa Cruz was the first department who actually implemented predictive policing. And they're like, oh, the computer said there's crime here. So they're driving around looking very carefully, and you should watch that video. It's horrible. But it's a really good, gives you a really good understanding of what happens behind the scenes, right? So that's one aspect of predictive policing, of police using data. There's a different aspect, which is, well, can we actually take the same type of technology and turn it the other way around? And so what we've been doing the last few years is helping police departments identify police officers who are going to do things that they shouldn't be doing. That ranges from bigger things like unjustified use of force, shootings, but also smaller things like over-policing in certain areas, stopping people disproportionately. And it turns out police departments, a lot of police departments, not every police department unfortunately, cares about reducing that, because they want to improve eventually the relationships with the community, and this is a critical part of that. Except they've been using tech systems that are completely broken. They've had these systems installed that just don't work. because they are built by three people sitting around a table guessing what triggers these types of things. So it turns out we work with a few different departments, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, Nashville, San Francisco, to help build a system that predicts which officer is at risk of one of these incidents. And then the police department looks at that and assigns them the appropriate interventions. For example, we found a couple of predictors that are obvious in hindsight, but what were sort of recent dispatches to domestic abuse cases, especially involving kids. Those officers tend to be high risk of doing these things in the near future. Second one was dispatches to suicide attempts. Those are stress indicators, and there are things that police departments can do, cool down periods, counseling, or dealing with training in kind of crisis intervention. So again, the same technology that we have this horrible reaction to unpredictive policing can be turned around and used to actually improve public safety and police community relationship. It's just a matter of working with these departments, understanding what their problems are, collaborating with them, and then giving them something that they're able to use and move forward with.
Yeah, that's great. So, Ellen and Joy, in your introduction, you started talking about that in order for cities to harness technology, in order to ensure that cities can harness technology to address equity challenges, you need to understand and prioritize the problems that you're trying to solve, and let those drive the solutions rather than the technology drive the solution. Can you, maybe we can start with Ellen and then back to Joy. Can you tell us more about how you go through the process of identifying and prioritizing equity challenges? I know that some of your work has been focused on shared mobility, so maybe you can use that example or any other example.
Sure. So I can touch on shared mobility. I think maybe just a more direct answer to your question is in Philadelphia, we know we have one of the highest rates of deep poverty in the country. As a large city, we have a 26% deep poverty rate in Philadelphia. That is massive. And within that population, we also know that the majority of those folks that fall in that pocket either don't graduate from high school, they don't pursue a higher education degree, but even worse than that, they are all reading at a 4th grade level on average. And the low rate of literacy is a huge problem when it comes to trying to provide more information to your citizens, whether it's in a traditional form of a flyer or if it's on an application or if it's on our website. And so for us, looking at things like language access, both from looking at different languages, but also from, can people actually even read the English that we are producing in our materials? And so actually through a cable franchise agreement with Comcast several years ago in our previous administration, we were able to negotiate a funding mechanism through this franchise agreement called the Digital Literacy Alliance. And our team manages this program, and it actually activates and brings in community partners to provide digital literacy programming, which also tacks onto literacy. And we're using these partnerships to be able to provide our communities with training both in basic literacy as well as in how do we access really important services and information via the web on a computer. So a lot of us in this room, it's a lot of things that are super intuitive, but for our primary constituency, when we're talking about equity, we are thinking about those people in Philadelphia. And so that is one way in which we're doing that. That's actual dollars that are going out in the form of grants. And we have the telecom companies represented on that alliance. So it's community organizations, it's city government folks, it's also the private sector coming together to make decisions on who do we want to give and allocate funding to develop these really awesome programs. On the other side, when we think about things like shared mobility, Philadelphia has a bike sharing program like a lot of major cities across the country. And one way in which we were a little bit unique was in the way we're planning where these bike share stations go. So we actually crowdsourced and brought our urban planners along in this process to discover what communities that were not downtown, were not primary tourist attraction sites, but really were our neighborhoods. So people who are commuting all across the city need better, more diverse options for transportation, and doing a deep dive study on where could we put these stations to activate users. But then there's the other problem of, there's two things that we found out during this, was one, just because you put a bike station, just because you build it, doesn't mean they'll come. And part of the reason why is we found that some residents, they really just don't want to use bikes because it means you're poor. And I come from an immigrant family, and I know that from a cultural perspective, when you come to America, you want to get a car because that means you made it, and it's good to have a car. So that was one thing, and that's not something I think any of us could have ever assumed until we went here, met with our community members. The other thing was a lot of them didn't know how to ride a bike. So what do you do when there's a bike share and you don't know how to ride a bike? You just don't ride it usually, unless you're super ambitious and really interested. And then the third thing is a lot of the communities where we wanted to bring access to these bike share systems, they didn't have a credit card. And traditionally, these bike share systems, you need a credit card because that's how it tracks the trip, and that's how it tracks your users. And so the city had to kind of go back to the drawing board and say, okay, we built it, we put the bike shares there, it's really great, we're really excited, we did this whole crowdsourcing and people got to vote on where they wanted the stations, but now we need to get people to use it because we really believe in the health impacts and increasing access to different places across Philadelphia. And so as an interim solution, we actually had to create a paper vouch system and connect with our corner stores and be able to educate our communities and let them know, hey, that corner store you go to all the time? Well, there you can get a voucher to use the bike share system. But then in addition to that, another layer is we had to teach folks how to ride these bikes. And so the bike share is a public-private partnership. And from the private side, they allocated specific folks that would work with the city to implement bike education with the city. And so we have public computing centers, and we picked pilot partners. And we're now at our 7th cohort over the last 3 years, which is super exciting. And we train community members how to safely ride a bike. We teach them how to navigate the bike route maps. And we also give them several months of free bike share access. And so this is a very holistic approach. It's very time consuming. It's a lot of stakeholders. But I think it's something that we're really proud of. And we know it's not perfect, but it's something that we're proud of. And hopefully it also kind of highlights a little bit how you really have to think about all these different pieces along the way. And as you learn and you make some mistakes and make certain bad assumptions, how do you fix them and how do you work in a relatively agile way to address those challenges?
Joy, same. The process to identify and prioritize the problems, then solutions come after that. But let's talk about that process first.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't always get the opportunity to prioritize the problems. It's just this is what we're working on right now, right? And so, a lot of just very generally and basically, it's getting, so importantly, and y'all mentioned it before, getting subject matter experts in the room with technologists early on instead of waiting until the end and then an idea has already arisen, right? And so, just kind of, for example, with opportunity zones that we just we just proposed, and we were fortunate enough as DC to be considered one of the states in getting that came out of the new tax bill, the new tax law, of getting very specific areas in the city qualified for many tax breaks, and so. Because I work on mapping at work and I do GIS, I was asked to run some analysis on, based on census tracts with unemployment, median family income, and poverty rates. And I thought at that time it was just me making maps of of polygons, which I do all the time. And just like a whirlwind of 6 months later, our team was like, look, we just created policy. We were able to nominate 25 census tracts from a lot of disadvantaged neighborhoods, but also ones that have a lot of great potential to get businesses coming to our district and offering incentives. And so just being a part of that process, but also there were several rounds of integrating the public and getting public feedback, getting surveys back from people, from a very basic level, me asking my own friends who have lots of thoughts about gentrification in DC and where businesses should go, and just getting really great feedback. And so just getting this basic concept of accessibility and getting everyone in the room who are experts at these certain fields, but also getting technologists who are able to relate as well.
So, right, you joked earlier that you judge cities, but you don't work in one of them. But I have a serious question about evaluating a city's tech policies for inclusion gains. Is that happening, and if so, how?
I don't think it's happening in a systematic way. I think it happens very ad hoc. For example, Ellen, you were giving is a very rare example of, and it's a good but reactive example, right? It wasn't thought of that way in the beginning, and I think that's where I don't think people should be evaluating their policies. I think you should be working with them collaboratively to build them right in the beginning, right? And there's a big difference. Like there's a lot of traditional policy has been a lot of program evaluation. You've done a bunch of stuff. Now tell me if I did something right. And I think that's just the wrong way of doing it, right? It needs to be upfront, just like we talk about defining goals around efficiency and performance. Can we also define equity goals, right? So one of the things that we've been doing, which is really helping cities think about, okay, how do you operationalize equity? Right? And so for an example, I think if you take the bike share example, thinking about sort of if you're placing, it's not just about placement, right? It's about where should they be in order to make sure that, do people know about the bikes? Do people have access to the bikes? Do people equally, right? So do people know about it equally? Is there equity in access to the bikes? Is there equity in using the bikes? They might have access, but they're not using it. Do they work effectively for everyone, right? They can access it, but because they're designed for, bikes are relatively evenly designed for people, but other services are designed with certain people in mind and tested with certain people in mind, so they don't work equally. Do they have equal outcomes for everyone? Maybe certain people need to go from place A to place B, and B is just too far for biking. For a lot of people, it's the last mile problem. For other people, based on our transit infrastructure, it's a last 5 mile problem. And that bikes may not be able to solve equally. So I think the way we're sort of thinking about it is designing what we'd call sort of an equity audit, but really not to audit it afterwards, but designing in the design phase to say, okay, do you have knowledge equity? Do you have access equity? Do you have usage equity? Do you have effectiveness equity? Do you have outcome equity? And if you are missing one of those, then you know where to fill in the gap, right? We have access, they're just not using it. So can we now figure out why are they not using it? Well, they don't want to use it, they don't know how to use it. Let's now focus on those gaps as opposed to placing them in the right place or thinking about the larger. So I think that's what we're moving towards, is helping cities look at different services that they're providing, and especially on the digital side, right? I think Jimmy was talking about, well, everybody has free access to Lifeline, so they should be able to use our app. I bet your app is not being used equally by everyone, right? Just because they have access to Lifeline doesn't mean they consume that access and they get them. So I think it's our job in cities to make sure that we're putting these guidelines of, in order to have a service be deployed, it needs to meet these criteria. Same thing we've been doing we just released a bias audit tool for kind of predictive modeling, where right now there's a lot of, again, hype and conversations around the good things and the bad things. I think we need an objective set of metrics where before you work with consultants, you work with vendors, you work with researchers, doesn't really matter who you work with, before you deploy a service that's based on any sort of machine learning, predictive analytics, you need to audit it, you need to make the results of the audit public and justify if there are biases, why they're okay, because they might be biased, but it might be better than today, because today's services aren't unbiased, and unfortunately, we know that, but we sort of assume that if computer is imperfect, we should never use it. versus the right combination of. So I think those are the type of things we're working towards, building these tools that are operationalizing the language around equity and turning into more actionable things you can do, in addition to sort of having these types of conversations.
Yeah. So from the first panel, there were some questions about, how do social entrepreneurs and tech innovators work with city government? How do we, what's the door to be open? How does that work? Sort of to make sure the government gets the job easier, for lack of a better word, and enabling greater communication with constituents. So what is your perspective in terms of how do you work with entrepreneurs and with tech innovators? What have you seen?
Yeah, I think sometimes I do kind of harass my friends about, if you have a problem with government, there's an opening right here. Come join us. And they're like, have you seen that salary? And I'm like, all right, well, we're
social good.
But yeah, the public-private partnerships are so important. And I think that falls a lot on us in government to open those doors, right? And to have, make meaningful connections with people, with entrepreneurs, especially the creatives and other technologists and people. And so just for example, I think it was actually here, we had a huge housing insights project that was a partnership between a local government in DC and Code for DC, the Code for America Brigade. And we were able to work for a long period of time with Code for DC. And just background on that, no one's getting paid at Code for DC for their job. They all have their own day jobs, and they're all volunteering their time because they're very passionate about certain projects, right? And so really, and it's hard to ask for free help. I don't believe in that. And so, but it's so important to make partnerships with people who are very passionate about the subject matter that you need help with, and really finding ways to uplift them and the work they do. And even if it's someone's side project, but they're also being compensated on behalf of their jobs to work with government on small tasks. So it's not something that you need to dedicate your full-time job to helping local government on different issues, but you can certainly maybe give a couple hours a week. And we do that a lot with hackathons. And so I run them and I make them kind of hopefully as painless as possible. I know they're on Saturdays, but we provide like extra incentives to come. We get really great partnerships, like the Washington Post hosted our hackathon last year. Also, other incentives are offering courses and classes for people who are interested in maybe D3 for data visualization, or other workshops, even Tableau. And so offering some sort of incentive to get people out and work on things they're very passionate about, and continue working with them even the days and weeks after the hackathon and checking in.
Okay.
So,
yeah. Ellen, you have a...
I think it requires a level of serious intentionality. So we also partner with our local Code for America group, Code for Philly. And one way over the last 2 years in which we've been able to bridge a gap between the civic tech community in Philadelphia and with our department was to be able to scope out challenges that were actually relevant to us truly. I think prior to several years back, there's a big change that's happened with city government, and it's that everyone outside of city government now wants to actually work with city government. Whereas before, I really feel like everyone's like, oh my God, I never ever want to look over at city government. Procurement processes are awful. They're so slow. Get me out of here. Don't even look at me if you work for city government. And all of a sudden, my phone is constantly ringing, and everyone's like, we want to do stuff for you. Tell me what you want to solve. And I'm like, wow, I have so many problems. I don't even know where to start. But what was happening is, as this shift was happening, and as we were releasing things like open data sets, people outside of city government were trying to create these solutions that seemed like really logical, seemed really great. They're all open source. And what would happen is they would create them and they'd be like, hey, I created this awesome product for you, city government. And the city government was like, okay, thank you. And then the room gets silent. And so now what we're trying to do is be able to pitch ideas and find a champion within city government to actually participate in these regular conversations. So they meet on a very regular basis, and we encourage people to be a part of that. Our team hosted and facilitated a workshop to scope out specific areas that departments were interested in learning more about. And that was one step. Actually implementing the solutions, I think, is where we get stuck. And being able to scale these open source solutions that are being created by the community. It's very hard. It's not as simple as we created this and now you can do it. You know, there's a whole other group of folks who, and this is kind of where I was getting at with my question on workforce. It's a very difficult question, so I apologize for posing it, but it's something that we deal with. There's a lot of people still in city government who, they hear open source and they don't know what you're talking about. We have these blue screen monitors that you can't even use a mouse on. And so we're talking about legacy systems and things like that. And so when we bring in a new application where we tell them, all that work that you're doing for 10 years, we totally changed everything. It can be, a bit daunting. Yeah. And so we are currently in a process in internal discussions to talk about, from a strategic perspective and from a community development perspective, how are we actually going to operationalize these solutions that are being driven by the community? I'm a yes man, and so if an entrepreneur is like, hey, I'm this startup in Philly and I have this really cool solution, can I just talk to somebody to pick their brain? I will go above and beyond to try to do that, but I'm only one person. And so I think from a systems level, we need to think about, from a leadership perspective, what's our capacity to actually take on those kind of conversations, and what's our ability to be transparent enough to be able to provide that kind of feedback to a private sector community without making things seem like we're showing favoritism to a company or other, which is really what it comes down to. We have these integrity rules in place that make it really hard sometimes to do some of these more open-ended conversations and things that will drive things like, we love innovation. Yeah.
So I have a question about my own personal interest, and maybe Rajit can help me with this. So when you're thinking about cities that are trying to close equity gaps or advance equity goals using technology, do you feel that cities in the United States are behind or ahead of the curve with respect to cities outside of the United States? Like, do you do some international work? Do you have some perspective on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's a us versus them. I think we're a global. Just kidding. So we're serious. I think. So I didn't grow up in the U.S. So I didn't quite drink the greatest country in the world Kool-Aid. I have 3 passports. I'd like to have 7, one from each continent. That's been my life goal. So U.S. is one country. Who cares? I'm not being recorded. I'm being recorded. Never mind. No, I think what's happening is we talk about equity. One way of achieving equity is to provide nothing to everyone, right? And that's perfect equity. None of us want that. It's fair, but completely unjust. And so I think we want both effectiveness and equity. Right. And I think what's happening is, I don't think any city, to be honest, is intentionally prioritizing and operationalizing equity right now. Nowhere in the world. There are cities where there's no service for anyone, and so that's why I was saying, I can say that these cities are equitable, but there's just because they have no services. So I think over the last, probably I'd say, 5 to 8 years, U.S. cities have become more intentional about improving services with technology and data. And it's mostly because the infrastructure existed, where they were collecting data for administrative purposes, for compliance purposes, and they realized, we could repurpose it to do something better. I think a lot of other countries don't have that infrastructure at the local level. Right? A lot of other things are more federal, where here federal government has outside census and IRS. Luckily, there's no data there, so they can't do much. But in other countries, things are, right now we're working with El Salvador, where they have every single student record for the entire country in one place that's connected and linked together so they could provide services. So I think right now U.S. cities are on average, much further ahead in terms of providing better services. In absolute terms, not nowhere close to where they should be, but they're further ahead. But it's a pretty easy gap for other cities to fill as they start kind of looking at. So I think the U.S. is being used. A lot of examples are coming from here that can be easily replicated. I think the biggest gap is what Ellen said, is being able to implement these solutions. So everybody's doing a bunch of prototypes, right? There's a new prototype. It's very easy to try something out. It takes years and years and years to get it into production and working and operationalizing it. And I think that's where it's going to take probably outside the U.S. cities much faster, because they're not dealing with a lot of legacy. There's nothing there. So you can kind of build the right thing, as opposed to here, there's so much legacy that it takes so long. So I think U.S. cities are on average ahead right now on providing better services with tech and data. They lack the capability to turn that into implemented systems, because it just takes very long. So we'll see where they go. But I think that's where the gap we need to fill is. We need to continue to do prototypes and testing, but we need to really think about ways of creating infrastructure that can operationalize it and deploy these things, because otherwise there's zero impact, and that's what we're really going after.
Could I just add to that? Yeah. So, I mean, you hit it, and part of that is strong central governments everywhere else and not necessarily here. We have a very colorful way of doing democracy in the US. The other thing is that other countries are insanely investing in basic infrastructure. And for folks in city government, we're like, well, we're just talking about potholes at this point. In the U.S., if you look up smart city, innovations, you're going to see a ton around potholes. Or pot, right? Pot or potholes, right?
Providing faster pot to everyone on demand is the new. I think that's what the VCs are investing in now.
Yeah, but it's like, I just got back from a trip to Korea, and I know for a fact they're not like, well, we really want to do potholes as an innovation. I was in the middle of nowhere and I had free Wi-Fi. So it's just like a totally different perspective on where the big government is actually allocating major funds to local governments. And we really gotta, as a local government entities, we really have to be loud about that. There's a lot of stuff that we talk about in the US about aging infrastructure that's not necessarily being discussed elsewhere, because they get to do a lot of greenfield developments. And that changes how you embed technology.
Great. Okay, so we are checking and see who has a question for our panelists. I see 1, 2, 3. Let's go in that order.
Hi, so a lot of you guys talked about the importance of making things accessible by thinking about accessibility from the beginning, both in terms of making sure that you're servicing all communities, but that you're making technology an aspect of the policy solutions that you're creating. What is being done, to your knowledge, to ensure that the disability community is an aspect of that conversation, especially when it comes to technological innovations that might be more difficult for people with vision impairment or a cognitive disability?
Thank you. Who would like to?
I can speak up for that. I think when we talk about communities for disabilities, the biggest role in which city government plays is managing our right-of-way. And so it's not necessarily a technology thing, but it goes back to that baseline infrastructure. Are we lowering our curbs to make sure that people who are handicapped are able to go up to them easily? And so those are things that we're addressing from a very basic level, but we do have service providers, and we do provide support to folks who are trying to increase accessibility of services and improving quality of life for people with disabilities. And so a great example, you could look into this. This is not a City Philadelphia program, but Inglis House in Philadelphia actually got to pilot Amazon Alexas, and they're trying to see if the Amazon Alexa platform can actually learn how people with disabilities speak and be able to actually help them be more independent in their apartments and all of that. And so it's not a perfect system, but I think that's one interesting way in which I personally was like, this is really cool and really awesome, and let me see though how well it actually works out. But that would be one example.
I think I would go back to thinking about it as, what is your definition of equity, right? Do you want every person with any type of handicap to be able to access a service equally. That may be too expensive to achieve. So what is your actual operational definition? But then you want to measure it. You want to say, okay, they all it's on a smartphone. Let's assume for now, which is a horrible assumption, that people have access because of that. You might have 80% effectiveness for people with certain type of disabilities, 20% effectiveness here, and then you go back to because I think prematurely sort of designing for everyone when you don't know who needs it, because you want to make sure you prioritize the people who have a need for that service, right? And so if nobody with a certain type of disability is ever going to use this, then why are we spending the extra money to make this service accessible to them when that could be spent making a different service accessible to them? So I think it just requires a little bit more deliberation and conversations with the users of this service to understand who they are, how they're accessing the service, and is it actually working for them? And then going back to the usability community and say, okay, how do we design for this gap that's not being filled today?
You had a question? Go right there.
So in Washington, D.C., we're dealing with two issues that are related to equity. I don't know if it addresses the technology aspect, but one is the city is rewriting its comp plan. And as it does its comprehensive plan, how, are there examples of the use of technology and better understanding zoning and related kind of issues? The other is the city, of course, like some other cities, all are trying to attract Amazon to locate its headquarters here. But I've seen no real analysis of, well, what would that mean? What's the dynamics of that? How does that affect equity? And are there places, databases, engines that are designed to run scenarios? How do we as citizens, in essence, check government? Because government says these things are great, but I don't see the data that backs that. The government tends to cherry pick in order to get the answer that they want.
And for those, the comp plan, for those who don't know, it's all about how cities spend housing and community development dollars. That's what the comp plan is all about.
It's all you.
Yeah, I absolutely cannot speak on behalf of DC government on this. I think it's very important. I think what I have to even remind myself is it hasn't gotten there yet, specifically with Amazon. Amazon has made no offers to DC. I know just as much as everyone else does know about that. And so it's hard to try to find resources to run scenarios for things that are strictly hypothetical now. But I think it's also very important to acknowledge that things could change. But when you think about big businesses in general coming to the city, it's never overnight that there are 20,000 new jobs, right? Things change very, very slowly, especially when it comes to entire cities. And so we have to keep in mind that I think it would be very difficult to run some sort of analysis on what would happen if any large institute came into the city, because it would be something that happens over the span of 20 or 30 years. But sorry, I can't really answer that. And you talk about the comp plan and how that's still being worked on. It's been worked on for a very long time, which just kind of shows how important it is and how many factors there are in it. So it's definitely not something that one person just snaps and says we've changed the entire city upside down. There's lots of processes for the change.
I'd just like to add, you should continue asking that question. I think it's the city's responsibility for every time they're proposing any new development to do an equity analysis and say, here's what we think is going to happen and here's how it's going to affect these people. Here's our plan to mitigate that. It's just a standard practice that needs to happen, and unless we ask for it, we're not going to get it. And it needs to be audited from an outside entity who can confirm that it actually meets. I'll give you a quick example of a project we did with Seattle about 9 months ago. They decided to build, they call this bus rapid transit lines across the city. And they didn't really do much of an equity analysis when deciding that, but then they realized, well, it's going to go into deployment in 2 years, but we're realizing that it could have equity problems. It's going to displace certain people disproportionately. It's going to affect other people's transit negatively. What we would like to do is figure out how do we change we can't change that, it's already been decided, but how do we change the transit system around it so it doesn't impact anyone negatively based on where they are today. And with that goal, we then work with them to figure out the data we had around transit usage and looked at what types of people was it going to affect and what types of bus schedule changes, route changes, and stop changes we need to make in order to make sure that it stays, the transit time doesn't go up for anyone who's affected by it. So I think it's just important, and Seattle's doing a really good job of they have an equity council. I don't know enough about other cities if you guys are doing that or not, but I know Seattle definitely is thinking about when they do a new development, they have an equity council that talks about the implications and tries to mitigate as many of these risks as possible.
Apparently, the National League of Cities is very interested in this discussion, so they're asking, someone is watching online and they're asking, I really like what Raid said about breaking down a problem into components to assess equity. Could he give an example of a specific problem he worked with and how they unpack the essential elements? Very quickly, we don't have a lot of time.
I mean, I think the problem, I mean, we can just rewind and repeat what I was just making up on the spot with Ellen and the bike. But I can follow up with them. It's going to probably take longer than.
I imagine that. You had a question.
I just wanted to ask about sort of.
But hold for the mic so that people can hear you.
On the topic of safeguards and unintended consequences, I wanted to ask about sort of, whether it's privately sponsored technology platforms or if it's publicly sponsored technology platforms, because if you agree with the premise that technology, because it's dependent on data and the network effect, every sort of technology platform ends up becoming some sort of a monopoly or a private government. And so how does the government and regulations safeguard against that? Are they going to be able to keep up with it like they weren't with Uber when it first came out, or with Facebook, with elections, or now even with Amazon private label support over third parties? So just want to understand your opinion on that front.
Everyone's looking at me. All right. The problem is partly because we're behind. We talked about how, we're both in tech, but we know I've also never been in private technology. So I don't know what that world's like. My brother's in startup, it's a whole other thing, but we're always behind. And so unfortunately, we're not only stuck with proprietary systems, but we've been stuck with them for a long time. And until our procurement processes change to allow us to be able to get out of them in a quicker pace, that's going to continue to be our problem. That being said, I think that for city government now, it's more important than ever for us to have a seat at the table. And also to create opportunities to learn and be educated about what's happening in the marketplace, just so that we can at least keep it in mind. Really, we do things like requests for information and requests for proposals. Those are really antiquated ways of learning about the marketplace. They're also not the best ways to do that, and we know that. And so, part of the work that we're trying to do in Philly is to really challenge that notion of that's the best way to make things competitive and equitable from a marketplace perspective, and see what are the kind of pathways we can create to actually increase market knowledge, innovation knowledge, partnering with universities and being able to share the burden across different stakeholders, including community members, to make sure that we're not getting locked into systems that we're not going to be unhappy with. But you look all around a lot of our U.S. cities, we're stuck with a lot of architecture that we will be stuck with for a long time, and that's the same thing with technology. So I think that's just a bit of the reality and also the fun and the challenge of the work that we do.
I mean, I want to make sure. I think I criticize city governments a lot, right? But because I want to help them. But I think behind, I wouldn't say behind, right? I think a lot of people who see the tech world think, oh, we're behind. I think we have very different challenges. We don't choose our customers. We don't choose we can't fire a customer if we don't like them. We have to provide certain services to everyone, and that's not a choice where, free market doesn't work here. So I think we're just dealing with challenges that are very, very different. Every tech company has legacy issues. they spend, they do 5-year, 10-year data warehousing plans that then go obsolete as soon as they're built. So I think all the same issues that we talk about in government exist in most large tech companies. And that's just, at least we're focusing on the right problems. At least we're talking about equity. Which tech company is talking and actually doing anything about equity? Nobody, as far as I've seen, right? They might be talking about it, but it's not a first order goal and mission of the company. It's, because their shareholders are come first. We don't have that constraint, so we can do some of these things. So I think we have to give a little bit of credit for you guys who are doing really hard jobs without many resources. And I don't think you're behind. I think you're ahead in thinking about what people need and how to provide it them. You just need more people coming in saying, we can help. And luckily, for the wrong reasons, it's happening right now. So let's take advantage of that, I think, and we can really use that help and move forward. And so anybody who's interested, come talk to them and see how they can help.
I appreciate the encouragement.
And with that, join me in thanking the panelists for this great critique. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thank you. I'm Solomon Green. I'm a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute. I have the unenviable task of trying to wrap up this really rich and layered and complex discussion, trying hopefully reflect on some key takeaways, but the unenviable part is I'm standing between you and those of us in the room and who will enjoy a reception afterwards, magically revealed behind that curtain when it opens in a few minutes. So I hope you will stay with us for that. I'll keep my remarks short, but I definitely want to thank everyone who made this event possible, especially our panelists who brought such tremendous insight and for all the amazing work they're doing with and for communities who are too often left on the sidelines of tech innovations. Jimmy Chen, Matt Hoffman, Karen Jane, and St. Mayer, who helped us understand how tech applications can be very carefully and intentionally designed to address equity challenges. Joy Witt, Ellen Huang, and Raid Ghani, who helped us understand how cities and city leaders can adopt inclusive tech policies and build new and inclusive partnerships. I want to thank all of my colleagues here at the Urban Institute who were instrumental in making this summit a success. Sarah Rosen-Wartell, who kicked us off today. I also want to thank her for her leadership in ensuring that at the Urban Institute, we're infusing technological innovation into everything we do to elevate the debate on the crucial policy issues of our day. I want to thank Gustavo Velasquez for moderating the panel, but also for his leadership in developing an inclusive partnership here in DC, which is not always focused on technology, but is very focused on equity and making Greater DC a place of opportunity for all. And if you want to learn more about the Urban Greater DC Partner Initiative, I encourage you to log on to greaterdc.urban.org, right? Wealth of information and tools on there that I think you would find interesting and very relevant to this conversation. I want to thank Tanaya Srini from our research team who helped identify these incredible panelists and make sure that they were prepared to have such a rich discussion, and Ivy Hunter and Alana Morrow from our events team who made sure everything ran smoothly. Last but not least, I want to thank our partners at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth for supporting this event. The center really is at the forefront of developing innovations to connect people and communities to opportunities and support financial inclusion through new approaches to philanthropy and cross-sector collaboration. And harnessing innovation in data and technology are central to their model. You can learn more about the center at mastercardcenter.org. I want to thank Sandy Fernandez for welcoming us earlier this afternoon, and BJ Mahal for moderating the panel on technology and action. Both Sandy and BJ have not only been such incredible supporters to the Urban Institute, but valuable thought partners as we seek to deepen our impact in this space. So thank you so much. So I was the guy sitting at the front of the room, busily scribbling notes, trying to come up with some way of synthesizing, again, this really complex and layered discussion. And I realized probably too late that Twitter was already doing all that work for me. So I also want to thank everybody who's been live tweeting this event. I mean, we really have captured so many incredible insights already on social media. And I'm the one who's not tech savvy enough to be able to scroll through Twitter, so I've been using the old school paper method. But I really appreciate that across both panels, they contributed to helping us at the Urban Institute, and I think us in the room and those of us who were tuning in via the webcast, to really define this somewhat elusive and certainly ambitious notion of innovation for inclusion, right? We talked about harnessing technology to create more equitable cities. And when we talk about that, I think what the panel, these panels helped us realize is we're actually talking about at least 4 things. And the first is that we can and must use technology to understand inclusion challenges. Data generated by new technologies can reveal disparities in access to opportunity that might otherwise have been difficult to detect. And we heard about that when Matt talked about Enterprise Community Partners' Resility app and how they're using it not only to connect residents to opportunity, but also to understand their needs and wants and improve how Enterprise and its partners can build greater bridges to opportunity. We heard about that in Code for America's Clear My Record platform, where through the process of developing it, you realized and identified the rap sheet as a barrier to record clearance, and not content just to use the original platform that was geared towards individuals, using what you learned about overcoming barriers to support more wholesale and effective public sector approaches. Second, we can and must create inclusive processes to shape technology development and deployment. And this is true whether it's at the level of the app or the smart city. Without strong engagement efforts, groups and communities that lack power or access to technology may be shut out of the conversation, may be shut out of the planning process. And as a result, the products or the projects will fail to meet their needs. We certainly heard about that when Joy talked about their work on DC hackathons here in the district. We heard it when Ellen talked about how Philadelphia crowdsourced the location of the bike stations to make sure that they were serving communities that had the greatest need. I actually think it's also reflected in the personal stories from our panelists. Jimmy's story of how he chose to use the tools that he gained, the playbook from Facebook, to social good. And I love the fact that Joy and Ellen confessed on stage that they are not coders, and that this is a project that will take people with diverse backgrounds and skills. We can and must be intentional about the uses of technology that can drive inclusive outcomes. We can't assume that technological innovation will lift all boats, or as Gustavo said, we need to think about and think about technology as a means, not an end. Intentional design for equity can involve inclusive processes that I just mentioned, but it can also involve rethinking fundamentally how we do business as private entities, as cities, as nonprofits. We heard about that when Jimmy's talked about Propel's Fresh EBT app as a different approach to improving the delivery of public services, and Raid's equity audit as operationalizing equity in the design phase of developing tech policy. Fourth, and finally, we can and must use technology to measure progress and learn how we can do better. And Kieran shared that when she talked about Neighborly's impact evaluation stack. And again, the Clear My Record example of evolving as you're developing the solution to find the deepest impact. These are dynamic and interconnected aspects of inclusion, and they can't be accomplished alone. They have to be accomplished together. And I think in the end, that was what was so inspiring and impressive about each of our panelists. Their organization and teams are weaving together these four aspects of inclusion: problem identification, broad and inclusive engagement, intentional design, ongoing measurement, and learning so seamlessly. Last, I think a consistent theme through both panels is that technology alone does not erase structural barriers that drive economic and racial inequalities in our cities and our communities. But it can be used to reduce these barriers at the structural level. Kieran talked about this when she talked about how Neighborly is trying to address the digital divide through expanding broadband access, which is a key precursor to taking advantage of technological innovation for so many communities. We heard about this in terms of Clear My Record as removing barriers that people who've had encounters with the criminal justice system face in accessing jobs and housing. And we certainly heard about this in Philadelphia, where the design of the bike share program was to address some of the root causes that may prevent communities from using the system, such as access to financial services or credit cards and digital literacy. Sometimes these tech conversations can seem so daunting. And I think that was the response we got when the question about the future of work came up. There was a pause, because these seem like forces that are coming upon us, that are uncontrollable, unmanageable. And what I found so inspiring about each of the contributions of the panelists is how they were breaking down these challenges into solutions, solvable problems, putting people first and leading with their values. These are all insights that we are going to carry with us and continue to explore as we launch our Innovation for Inclusion program at the Urban Institute later this summer. As Sarah mentioned, this program will have multiple components. We will publish a framing paper, and for those of you in the room, we've distributed a report of a preview of what that report will look like, and you can access it online on the event webpage as well. But we'll summarize some of the challenges and opportunities community leaders face in harnessing technological innovation in 4 key areas: smart infrastructure, shared mobility, civic tech, and big data analytics. But we'll also collect insights from across the Urban Institute on these issues and launch a program page where you can readily access them. With support from the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, we'll also produce exploratory research and blog posts on these cutting-edge issues. And we're going to continue the conversation with innovators and change makers like those represented on the panels today to shape our research agenda and help fill knowledge gaps. So keep an eye out for the launch of the program later this summer. And for everyone who's registered for the event, we will send you an announcement. And for those of you in the room, I want to encourage you to join us for the reception afterwards, get a chance to meet our panelists in person, mix and mingle. For those of you who are joining us via webcast, I do want to encourage you to continue the conversation with us. This is new work. This is work we are developing, and we will greatly benefit from crowdsourcing some insights from people in the room and who have participated via webcast. You can reach out to me directly at sgreen, SGREENE, at urban.org, and I would be delighted to hear any feedback you have and suggestions for how we can help accelerate innovation for inclusion. Thank you so much.